Hello, curiosity gets comfortable, and the biggest questions in history are allowed to unfold at a gentler pace. Tonight we're heading into one of those subjects that never really stays where you leave it. You pick it up thinking it will be a story about one lost city, one old legend, one clever philosopher perhaps getting a bit carried away. And before long you are knee-deep in flood myths, strange maps, buried stone circles, underwater ruins, ice age disasters, and the uneasy feeling that the past may be far less tidy than we like to imagine. Our subject is Atlantis, or rather the increasingly peculiar trail that appears when people keep trying to pin Atlantis down and behave sensibly about it. At first glance, it should be a simple matter. Atlantis is either real or it is not. It either existed as some ancient place that vanished beneath the sea, or it belonged entirely to the realm of story, like a moral fable dressed in marble and seawater. That sounds wonderfully efficient, the sort of conclusion a very organized librarian would appreciate. But Atlantis has a habit of refusing to stay in one category. The deeper people dig into the idea, the stranger it gets. Not always stranger in a dramatic way, with flashing lights and secret chambers, and someone in a hat whispering that the truth has been hidden for centuries. Though Atlantis does attract that sort of thing, as jam attracts wasps. Stranger in a quieter, more stubborn way. The facts around it do not settle neatly. They spread, they connect to other puzzles. They touch ancient memory, disaster, migration, and the uncomfortable possibility that people in the distant past may have known more, built more, and lost more than we once assumed. Before we go any further, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight or today, depending on your little corner of the planet, and what time it is where you are right now. It feels especially fitting for a story like this, because Atlantis has always lived in that hazy space between then and now, between what we remember and what we can prove. One person hears the word and thinks of a myth from school. Another pictures a drowned civilization with temples and harbors. Someone else thinks of underwater documentaries, suspiciously confident internet threads, and the Risha structure showing up on their screen again at 2 in the morning when they were absolutely planning to go to bed at a reasonable hour. And if you find this kind of slow journey through old mystery soothing, interesting, or simply a good way to let your mind wander without falling directly into chaos, I would be very grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps this small, calm corner of the internet find other curious people who may also enjoy spending an evening wondering whether an ancient civilization vanished in a catastrophe while their tea goes cold beside them, which all things considered is quite a lovely niche to have now. Then settle in. This is not one of those subjects that improves when rushed. Atlantis has been hurried, oversold, mocked, romanticized, commercialized, and waved around as proof of nearly everything at one point or another. It deserves something slower than that. Not because every extraordinary claim tied to it is true, far from it, but because even the false turns tell us something. They tell us what people fear, what they hope, what they think history ought to look like, and how uncomfortable we become when the ancient world feels less primitive than we were taught. There is something deeply human in the idea of a lost world, not merely a city that fell, but a place that seemed complete and capable, and perhaps even impressive, and then was suddenly gone. We are drawn to that picture for reasons that are not hard to understand. Ruins alone already have a peculiar power over the mind. A broken wall in a field can make people quiet. A staircase leading nowhere is enough to stop a crowd. We do not need much. A few cut stones, an old harbor line, a fragment of inscription, and immediately the imagination begins furnishing the rest. Who lived here? Who worked here? Who argued here? Who thought their home would still be standing in 100 years? Add the sea, and the effect becomes stronger. Land can be revisited, forest can be cleared, sand can be brushed away, but water feels final. Once something slips beneath it, it enters a different category in the mind. Not merely buried, but removed. That is one reason Atlantis refuses to die. It is not only a question about one place. It is a question about how much can disappear, how much human life can be erased, not just physically, but culturally, until all that remains is a distorted memory in a story that later generations mistake for metaphor. We know small versions of this happen all the time. Languages vanish. Towns are flooded by dams. Coastlines retreat. Earthquakes level settlements. Fires destroy archives. Even in the modern age, with satellites and servers, and more photography than any sensible species should probably produce, memory is fragile. So when we turn toward deep antiquity, toward the end of the last ice age, and the beginning of settled civilization, it is not absurd to wonder what was lost. Not Atlantis exactly, not yet, but lost things in general, lost communities, lost coastlines, lost knowledge, lost survivors of disasters later remembered in stories that sound exaggerated only because the original world behind them is gone. What makes Atlantis especially slippery is that it enters the historical record wearing two outfits at once. On one side, it arrives as a polished philosophical tale in the work of Plato, one of the most famous writers in all of ancient Greece. That alone makes many scholars cautious, and understandably so. Plato was not a journalist. He did not operate a fact-checking department near the academy with a stern assistant muttering about source quality. He used stories. He used idealized societies, invented dialogues, and carefully shaped narratives to make larger points about politics, virtue, corruption, and the fate of states. When he describes Atlantis, he does so in a way that looks suspiciously useful for his broader themes. A rich and mighty power grows arrogant, wages war, and is destroyed. That has the tidy shape of a lesson. And history tends to become suspicious when something is just a little too tidy. And yet on the other side, Plato does not present Atlantis simply as a fairy tale. He gives it lineage. He places it in relation to Egypt, to Solon, to priestly records, to a time before the known Greek past. He names things. He describes geography. He situates Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which most people associate with the Strait of Gibraltar. He is specific in ways that invite either trust or annoyance, depending on your temperament. A vague legend is easy to dismiss. A detailed one is much more irritating because now you must decide whether the detail means authenticity, literary craft, or both. This is where the subject begins to misbehave. If Atlantis were only a story in Plato and nowhere else in the wider landscape of ancient memory, it would still be fascinating but easier to contain. The trouble is that once people began looking outward, they noticed patterns that were not proof of Atlantis, certainly not, but were interesting enough to keep the question alive. Many cultures preserve accounts of catastrophic floods. Many ancient traditions speak of earlier ages destroyed by water, fire, or upheaval. Coastlines that are dry land today were once under deep ice, and coastlines now underwater were once inhabited plains. During the last ice age, sea levels were much lower. The world map familiar to coastal peoples thousands of years ago was not our map. Then the climate changed. Ice melted, seas rose, weather shifted, and entire habitable regions vanished beneath expanding shorelines. Not overnight everywhere, not with one single worldwide wave, as popular imagination likes to picture it, but across generations, and sometimes violently enough to scar memory. That by itself does not give us Atlantis. It gives us something more modest and in a way more unsettling. It gives us a realistic setting in which stories of drowned lands could emerge from real human experience. It also forces a rather uncomfortable adjustment in how we picture prehistory. We often imagine people before the earliest known states as scattered, simple, and fundamentally limited. Yet archaeology has spent the last century and a half embarrassing that assumption again and again. Sites once thought impossible for their time have turned out to be quite real. Monumental construction appears earlier than expected. Long distance trade appears earlier than expected. Symbolic complexity appears earlier than expected. Social coordination appears earlier than expected. Human beings, it turns out, did not spend millennia sitting around waiting for us to grant them sophistication. A place like Göbekli Tepe has contributed greatly to that humiliation, which is one of archaeology's more endearing habits when it is in a good mood. Here was monumental stonework built astonishingly early, long before the neat textbook sequence many people had grown comfortable with. First agriculture, then villages, then temples, then large organized ritual centers. Nice and orderly. Thank you very much. Instead, the evidence suggested that ritual, gathering, symbolism, and large-scale coordinated building might have played a role in drawing people together before settled. Farming looked the way we expected. Not Atlantis again, but another reminder that the deep past may be more layered than our older models allowed. Then there are the drowned landscapes themselves. We know they exist because they must. The continental shelves were not empty decoration. People would have lived along rivers, estuaries, and coastlines, just as they have throughout history, especially in places rich in food and transport routes. When sea levels rose after the last glacial maximum, vast stretches of those lived in environments disappeared underwater. Most are now difficult to investigate. Sediment covers them, currents alter them. Modern seas are not ideal for preserving tidy little explanatory plaques. So there is a great deal we may simply not know. This is not an argument for Atlantis as commonly imagined, with shining concentric harbors and a royal palace waiting politely under the Atlantic until someone brings the correct flashlight. It is, however, an argument for humility. The archaeological record is not a complete ledger. It is a damaged sample of what survived on land, what happened to be buried in preservable ways, and what we have managed to find. That is where Atlantis becomes more than a yes or no question. It turns into a pressure point between two instincts. One instinct says we must be cautious, strict, and resistant to fantasy. Good, we should be. History is littered with confident nonsense. The other instinct says we should not become so rigid that we mistake gaps in evidence for evidence of impossibility. All so good. We should not do that either. Between those two instincts lies the uneasy territory where Atlantis continues to swim about smug as ever. Part of its endurance also comes from how emotionally useful it is. Atlantis can be whatever the speaker needs. To some, it is a warning about hubris. To others, it is proof of forgotten greatness. For a few, it becomes an excuse to attach every unexplained stone on Earth to a vanished super-civilization, usually while ignoring the actual people who built the very real monuments already in front of them, which is both historically unfair and quite lazy. There is a bad habit in popular mystery culture of seeing impressive ancient achievements and deciding they must have come from somewhere else, somewhere grander, somewhere conveniently unavailable for direct questioning. Atlantis has often been used that way as a magical holding pen for all unresolved wonder. That does the real past no favors. It also makes serious discussion more difficult because the subject becomes crowded with claims that are easy to dismiss and hard to clear away. Still, if we strip away the theatrical nonsense, something genuinely compelling remains. Could Plato's story have been inspired by older memories of real events? Could flood traditions preserve garbled echoes of post-Ice Age sea rise or regional disasters? Could there once have been coastal societies, perhaps quite advanced for their time, that were later submerged and forgotten? Could the memory of one or several ancient catastrophes have traveled through oral tradition, changed shape across centuries, and eventually reached the page in a form that was both historical residue and literary invention? Those are not absurd questions. They are difficult questions, but difficult is not the same as unserious. And then there is another small complication. People love to say Atlantis must be false because there is no evidence, while at the same time speaking as though the ancient world has already yielded most of its secrets. It has not. Not remotely. New sites appear. Old sites are redated. Entire assumptions collapse over a trench, a carving, a layer of ash, or a handful of seeds. One century says impossible. The next says, well, apparently not impossible, merely buried. That does not mean every bold claim will be vindicated. Most will not. It does mean that certainty should be worn with some care, especially when discussing periods of prehistory filtered through fragmentary records and changing landscapes. So as we begin this journey, it helps to keep two thoughts in the room at the same time. First, Atlantis, as popularly imagined, may well be a construction, a dramatic narrative shaped by Plato and inflated by later centuries into something far larger than its source material can support. Second, The world that produced and preserved such a story may indeed contain memories of real catastrophes, real drowned lands, and real lost cultures whose traces survive only in pieces. Those two thoughts are not enemies. In fact, they may belong together. The myth may be false in its details and still true in the kind of memory it carries. It may exaggerate, compress, moralize, rearrange, and still preserve a distant core of human experience. That lands can vanish, societies can fall, and survivors can turn history into story long before anyone thinks to call it archaeology. That is what makes Atlantis so difficult to leave alone. Once you stop asking, was there literally a city with this exact name and design, and start asking what kind of world would give birth to a tale like this, the whole landscape opens up. Suddenly, we're not dealing with a single missing island. We're dealing with ancient Egypt and Greek memory. We are dealing with climate instability at the end of the Ice Age. We are dealing with megalithic builders and submerged coastlines, and the possibility that some stories endure not because they are invented, but because forgetting them entirely would have felt dangerous. Somewhere behind the polished shape of the tale, there may be a bruise from a real blow. And because all strange roads need a proper beginning, the first place we really have to go is not the bottom of the sea, not the Sahara, not a half-submerged ruin with dramatic music playing over it, but ancient Greece, where Plato first set Atlantis down in writing and gave the world a story that has been causing trouble ever since. If Atlantis has a front door, this is it. Before the modern documentaries, before the maps with red circles on the Atlantic, before the underwater speculation and the endless parade of people insisting they have finally solved it, with a satellite image and a level of confidence that no human being has ever truly earned, there is Plato, not an explorer, not a sailor returning with reports from the Western Ocean, not a priest guarding some forbidden archive, a philosopher, a writer, a man with a gift for shaping arguments so elegantly that 2,000 years later, people are still trying to separate the lesson from the landscape. That matters because Atlantis does not first appear in a travelogue or a king list or a merchant account. It appears in two of Plato's dialogues, the TMUs and the Kritas written in the 4th century BCE. That simple fact has done more to complicate the subject than perhaps anything else. Had Atlantis turned up in a blunt administrative text, people might have treated it like a place awaiting confirmation. Had it appeared in a myth collection with gods changing shape and mountains talking back, people might have dismissed it more easily. Instead, it arrives in that uncomfortable middle ground where Plato often liked to work, a place where narrative and philosophy overlap just enough to make later readers argue for centuries. The most famous basic outline is easy enough to summarize. Beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which the Greeks generally associated with the gateway at the western end of the Mediterranean, there lay a great island larger than Libya and Asia Minor together. At least in Plato's telling, this island was Atlantis. It was rich, powerful, and technologically impressive by the standards of the story. Its capital was arranged in rings of land and water. Its kings ruled over a broad maritime empire. It possessed fertile plains, harbors, temples, metals, walls, canals, and all the other ingredients necessary for a civilization to sound both enviable and doomed. Atlantis then became corrupt, arrogant, and aggressive. And in the tale, it eventually launched war against lands inside the Mediterranean, only to be resisted by a virtuous prehistoric Athens. Afterward, in a single dreadful interval of destruction, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, and the old Athenian defenders were destroyed as well. On paper, it is a wonderful story. Too wonderful, many would say. It has scale, drama, morality, architecture, catastrophe, and a built-in map clue. It hands later generations almost everything they could want except a set of coordinates and a signed affidavit. But the more closely one looks at how Plato presents it, the more difficult it becomes to decide what kind of story this is supposed to be. Plato does not say, "Here is a useful myth I have invented to make a political point." He frames the account more carefully than that. In the tease, the story comes to the speakers through Solon, the famous Athenian lawgiver, who is said to have heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais. Those priests, according to the tale, told Solon that the Greeks remembered only fragments of the ancient past because periodic catastrophes had wiped out earlier civilizations and their records. Egypt, by contrast, preserved much older knowledge. From that preserved knowledge came the story of ancient Athens and Atlantis, set some 9,000 years before Solon's time. Plato's dialogue then positions itself as the retelling of this old account. Now, if one is looking for reasons to distrust the Atlantis story, there are several right there. The chain of transmission is long, elegant, and impossible to verify. Plato writes centuries after Solon. The Egyptian source is not independently identifiable. The account appears in a philosophical context where larger moral and political themes are clearly in play. The number 9000 years is suspiciously vast by Greek historical standards, especially given what was actually known in Plato's day about the age of civilizations. Even the scale of Atlantis, larger than Libya and Asia together, feels less like cautious reporting and more like a storyteller deciding that moderation would be a waste of everyone's time. Yet the story does not feel careless. That is the problem. Plato anchors it with names, institutions, geographic markers, and what appears to be a serious claim about historical memory. He gives Atlantis a genealogy. It is said to have been founded when Poseidon took a mortal woman named Cleito and enclosed her dwelling with rings of sea and land. Their descendants became the kings of Atlantis, 10 lines of rule descending from 10 sons. The capital city is described with enough specificity to tempt every later searcher into drawing diagrams. The central island, the concentric channels, the bridge works, the harbors, the Great Plain, the mountains to the north, the canal cut to the sea, the temple of Poseidon and Cleito, the walls plated in different metals, the famous oracle glowing with prestige and ambiguity. This is not vague legend language. This is descriptive construction. It gives the reader the unnerving impression that the author wants the place pictured clearly. That clarity is one reason Atlantis remains so difficult to file away. Plato's island is not merely a moral abstraction. It has topography. It has engineering. It has logistics. Even its army and transport systems receive attention. There are war chariots, horsemen, infantry divisions, naval power, territorial administration. The plain is laid out in measured rectangles. Irrigation channels bring water across the land. The city seems built to impress a reader who likes organized grandeur and would not mind a little impending punishment attached to it. So, what was Plato doing? The mainstream scholarly view has long leaned toward the idea that Atlantis is chiefly a literary and philosophical invention. In this reading, Plato created or heavily reshaped the story to serve his recurring interests. He often wrote about the rise and decay of states, about virtue and corruption, about ideal societies and failed ones, about memory, law, and the instability of human affairs. Atlantis fits those concerns rather neatly. It is wealthy, ambitious, technically advanced, and morally compromised. Ancient Athens, by contrast, is portrayed as austere, orderly, and virtuous, almost suspiciously aligned with Plato's admiration for disciplined civic life. The confrontation between them has the feeling of a grand moral tableau. One civilization represents excess and imperial appetite, the other represents civic excellence and restraint. If that sounds like philosophy wearing armor, that is because it probably is. There's also the issue of incompletion. The Cretius, which contains the fuller description of Atlantis, breaks off before the story reaches its conclusion. That unfinished state adds its own strange quality. We never see Plato complete the destruction within the dialogue itself. We're told enough to know where it is heading, but the final literary shape is missing. For some readers, this incompletion makes the account feel even more tantalizing, as though part of the secret has been withheld. More sober minds would say it simply means Plato stopped writing or never finished the planned sequence. Still, incompletion leaves space, and Atlantis has always thrived in space. Then there is the matter of the Pillars of Heracles. In the ancient Mediterranean imagination, this was a meaningful boundary. The pillars marked the opening into the great outer ocean, the threshold beyond the familiar world of enclosed seas and heavily trafficked coasts. To say Atlantis lay beyond them was to place it in a region both geographically plausible and symbolically charged. It was not in some wholly mythical sky realm. It was west out past Gibraltar, where the Mediterranean opens into the Atlantic. Real enough to imagine, remote enough to remain untested. That is excellent placement if one is inventing a civilization meant to sound formidable and lost. It is also exactly the kind of placement that makes later literalists open an atlas and start pointing, and point they have. Over the centuries, Atlantis has been located near the Azores, in the Canary Islands, in the Caribbean, in Antarctica, in Spain, in the Sahara, in the North Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, and in places so geographically enthusiastic that one begins to suspect Atlantis is less a location than a migratory condition. Most of these identifications say more about the desires of the interpreter than about Plato's actual text. But the reason the search spreads so widely is built into that phrase, beyond the pillars of Heracles. It sounds like a clue, and people love clues, especially old ones, especially if they feel smarter when following them. Still, one does not need to be reckless to notice that Plato's geography is strange in an interesting way. He presents Atlantis as both an island and a gateway. Beyond Atlantis, he says, there were other islands, and from them a passage to the opposite continent surrounding the true ocean. That line has fascinated readers because it sounds startlingly expansive for a Greek text, almost as though the Atlantic world is being imagined as a route towards something larger. Still, some have taken this as evidence of hidden geographical knowledge. More cautious readers note that ancient thinkers often speculated about the form of the world in ways that mixed observation, inherited tradition, and conceptual geography. It is not necessary to imagine secret transatlantic maps to explain the passage, but one can see why people attempted. The date Plato gives is another major obstacle. 9,000 years before Solon would place Atlantis in a period far earlier than any civilization known to the Greeks, and far earlier than any classical city-state tradition. For a long time, this was taken as one of the strongest reasons to dismiss the whole account. Plato clearly had no access to modern prehistoric chronology. He could not have independently verified an advanced Bronze Age, much less an Ice Age society. So either the number is fictional, symbolic, exaggerated, mistranslated, or inherited from some source, with a completely different system of reckoning. Later writers have tried every available option. Some suggest the Egyptian years should really have been months, reducing the time span dramatically. Others think the number was inflated in transmission. Most classicists are unmoved by rescue efforts of that sort, because they tend to appear after the fact once readers realize the literal timeline is a problem. Even so, the number has had a strange afterlife. What once seemed obviously absurd began to feel slightly less tidy once modern archaeology pushed organized monumental behavior deeper into prehistory than many earlier scholars expected. Not because Plato was suddenly vindicated. He was not, but because the old confidence that nothing socially complex could lie that far back began to weaken. If people were building monumental ritual sites far earlier than once assumed, if post-glacial sea level rise really did drown huge habitable regions, if the transition from the Ice Age into the Holocene was marked by severe environmental disruption, then the distant setting of Atlantis stopped sounding impossible in the simple old way. It still sounded unsupported, but no longer laughable by default. That distinction matters. Unsupported is not the same as unthinkable. A great many discussions of Atlantis collapse because people slide too quickly between those categories. Plato's island, exactly as described with its ringed capital and imperial navy and dramatic destruction, remains unverified, and to many historians highly implausible as literal history. But the broader background against which such a story might resonate has become more complex. The world before the first classical histories was not empty. It was full of human beings adapting, building, moving, suffering losses, and leaving traces unevenly preserved. Even within antiquity, Plato's own readers were divided about how to take the story. Some later ancient authors seem to have treated Atlantis more literally than modern scholars are comfortable with. Others were skeptical. The tension was there from early on because Plato himself invited it. He did not label the account in a way that shuts the door. He made it detailed enough to feel historical and meaningful enough to function philosophically. It is the kind of narrative design that guarantees future trouble. And there is another reason Plato's island feels impossible, one that has less to do with geography and more to do with genre. Atlantis is too useful. It arrives as a lost enemy of idealized ancient Athens, allowing Plato to stage a contrast between civic virtue and imperial decadence in the distant past. Where the scale can be enlarged and the symbolism intensified, Athens is given a glorious prehistoric role that mirrors Plato's political imagination more than any recoverable Bronze Age reality. Atlantis, meanwhile, becomes the perfect foil, rich where Athens is disciplined, maritime where Athens is land-rooted in spirit, luxurious where Athens is moderate, expansionist where Athens is just. If an author creates a civilization that fits his thematic needs this well, suspicion is only reasonable. Yet literary usefulness does not automatically erase the possibility of borrowed material. Writers often construct from fragments already in circulation. A philosopher might hear stories about flooded lands, Western islands, Egyptian antiquity, old catastrophes, Minoan splendor, or the destruction of powerful states, and fold them into a larger composition. That possibility has fueled one of the more respectable lines of Atlantis speculation, that Plato did not invent the idea from nothing, but rather adapted older memories or motifs into a philosophically shaped narrative. The most popular version of this line connects Atlantis loosely with the Bronze Age eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, and the decline of Minoan civilization. The volcanic explosion in the 2nd millennium BCE was real and catastrophic. It devastated the island, generated tsunamis, spread ash, and disrupted the region. The Minoans of Crete were a sophisticated maritime culture with palaces, art, trade networks, and considerable prestige. One can see why modern interpreters were tempted to merge these facts with Plato's tale. A splendid seafaring civilization damaged by catastrophes sounds promising, but the fit is far from neat. Santorini lies inside the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The chronology is nowhere near Plato's 90000-year claim. The political and topographical details do not align cleanly. At best, the Minoan theory suggests that real cultural memories of catastrophe and maritime power may have influenced later imagination. It does not solve Atlantis. Other theories place the origin in Iberia, especially southwestern Spain, where Bronze Age settlements, marshes, and ancient memories of Western lands have inspired repeated speculation. Some point to Tartessos, the semi-legendary wealthy culture known to the Greeks in the far west, as a possible echo or influence. Again, there are suggestive overlaps, but no decisive match. Plato's description remains too large, too stylized, too narratively charged to sit comfortably on a single candidate. Atlantis behaves like a composite, or perhaps more accurately, it behaves like a story that has been given enough realism to masquerade as memory. And then there is the sea itself, a city swallowed in a day and a night of misfortune. This is one of the most quoted elements in the Atlantis account because it satisfies something almost primal in the imagination. Sudden destruction is easier to remember than gradual change. A single catastrophic event gives history a shape. But the reality of environmental disaster is often messier. Shorelines retreat across generations. Earthquakes strike one region while drought weakens another. Tsunamis devastate coasts, but survivors reinterpret what happened through myth and ritual. Volcanic eruptions become divine punishments. Floods become resets. If Plato inherited any very ancient memory at all, it would almost certainly have reached him already polished into narrative simplicity. Human beings do not preserve trauma as spreadsheets. That brings us back to why the island is impossible. Not impossible because there could never have been a powerful ancient society lost to disaster. History is full of societies lost diminished or transformed. Impossible because Plato's Atlantis sits at the intersection of too many functions at once. It is a place, a lesson, a foil, a memory claim, a geopolitical imagination, a Western mystery, and a catastrophe tale all bundled together. That makes it richer as literature and poorer as evidence. Every detail can be read two ways. The specificity can be taken as proof of genuine tradition or as proof of skilled invention. The Egyptian connection can be read as a source claim or as a prestige device. The Pillars of Heracles can be read as a map clue or as symbolic placement at the edge of the known world. The date can be read as corrupted memory or as impossible exaggeration. There is no clean seam where the philosophical fabric ends and the historical residue begins. Still, it would be a mistake to treat Plato's account as irrelevant simply because it is not straightforward history. On the contrary, it is relevant precisely because it preserves a particular ancient way of thinking about deep time, catastrophe, and cultural memory. The Egyptian priests in the story tell Solon that humanity has been destroyed many times, and that the Greeks are like children when it comes to remembering the old world. That is an extraordinary frame. It suggests that Atlantis belongs to a larger vision, in which civilizations rise and fall repeatedly, records are lost, and fragments survive unevenly across cultures. Whether or not Plato believed any specific historical core behind Atlantis, he clearly understood the persuasive power of lost memory. He knew that the authority of the ancient, the foreign, and the half-forgotten could make a story feel older than ordinary fiction. For that reason alone, Plato's island deserves to be taken seriously as an artifact of thought, even when one doubts it as literal geography. It shows us what could be imagined in classical antiquity about vanished worlds. It shows how Egypt functioned in the Greek imagination as a reservoir of primordial knowledge. It shows how easily political reflection can borrow the clothing of remote history. And perhaps most importantly, it shows the exact point at which the question of Atlantis stops being simple. Because once Plato claims that the Greeks had forgotten most of their own deepest past, the ground shifts. Now we're no longer only asking whether Atlantis existed. We are asking who was supposed to remember it, and why that memory survived in Egypt of all places. That is where the story grows stranger, and where the priests of Sires begin to step out of the background and into the center of the tale. Those priests of Sires are where the whole thing begins to feel less like a neat philosophical exercise, and more like a very old echo that keeps changing shape as you listen to it. Plato tells us that Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, traveled to Egypt and spoke with priests there, and that one of them, or perhaps several in different tellings, explained something deeply unsettling to him. The Greeks, they said, were like children when it came to the remote past. They remembered only the latest disasters, only the most recent upheavals, only the fragments that survived when fire, flood, and other calamities had swept older worlds away. Egypt, by contrast, preserved records. Egypt remembered. Egypt, in this telling, had not merely heard stories of Atlantis. It had kept the memory of an age that Greece had forgotten. That framing, more than any concentric harbor or shining wall, is what gives the Atlantis account its real staying power. Because now the story is no longer just about a lost island. It is about lost history itself. It is about the possibility that human beings have lived through disasters large enough to break continuity, erase archives, scatter survivors, and leave later cultures with only legends where facts used to be. That idea is powerful enough on its own. Attach it to Egypt, one of the oldest and most literate civilizations known to the ancient Mediterranean, and the whole thing becomes even harder to dismiss casually. Not easier to prove, certainly, but much harder to wave away with a cheerful little, "Oh, Plato made it all up," and then move on to lunch. To understand why this Egyptian link matters so much, it helps to step back and look at how Egypt functioned in the Greek imagination. To the Greeks of Plato's time, Egypt was old in a way Greece was not. Monumentally old, respectably old, slightly intimidatingly old. Greek temples were impressive. Greek poetry was rich. Greek thought was brilliant. But Egypt had pyramids. Egypt had dynasties stretching backward through what must have seemed to Greeks like impossible distances of time. Egypt had priesthoods, king lists, and temple archives. It had an atmosphere of continuity. Even when Greeks criticized Egypt, or treated it as exotic, they also treated it as ancient authority. So when Plato chooses to anchor Atlantis in Egyptian priestly memory, he is not doing so at random. He placing the story in the one cultural setting his readers would most readily associate with preserved antiquity. That does not mean the account is true in the literal sense. It means Plato knew exactly what he was doing. If you want a story to sound ancient, it helps to put it in very old hands. If you want it to sound preserved rather than invented, it helps to have priests recite it from records. If you want your audience to feel that their own history is thin and partial, it helps to have someone older and more established gently tell them so. There is almost a theatrical satisfaction in it. Solon, a revered Greek figure, goes abroad in search of wisdom and is told politely but firmly that Greek memory is shallow. It is a wonderful narrative device. It is also annoyingly the sort of thing that could have had a grain of truth in it. After all, Greece and Egypt did not occupy the same relationship to written continuity. Egypt had writing much earlier and used it across religious, administrative, and monumental contexts. Greek historical memory, especially when Plato was writing about events supposedly many thousands of years earlier, was much less securely anchored. If there had been very ancient Mediterranean catastrophes, cultural collapses, or vanished coastal communities in the deep past, the odds of their surviving in highly distorted form within later traditions would be much greater than the odds of their surviving as neat annual reports. Human beings do not pass down prehistory with careful footnotes. They pass it down as sacred story, warning, genealogy, flood legend, divine punishment, heroic migration, or some combination of all five with extra embellishment added by whoever happened to be doing the remembering. This is what makes the Egyptian priests so interesting. Not because we can verify their conversation with Solon. We cannot. Not because we possess the actual archive they are supposed to have drawn from. We do not. They are interesting because they introduce a theory of memory into the Atlantis story. They say, in effect, that civilizations forget. They say disasters do not merely kill people, they break transmission, they reduce deep history to fragments. In one of Plato's most important lines on the subject, the priests explain that many destructions of mankind have occurred and will occur again, some by fire, some by water, and that only those living in particular conditions preserve records across such breaks. That is a very striking idea to place inside a story that later readers would prefer to treat as either all myth or all history. It is neither of those clean things. It is a myth about the loss of history, and that is much more difficult to sort out. There is also something else worth noticing. The priests do not simply tell Solon about Atlantis. They also tell him about an ancient Athens, one older and better than the Athens of his own day, a city that once stood against the Atlantean power. This often gets less attention in popular retellings because Atlantis is the glittering disaster, and ancient Athens is by comparison a little too virtuous to be entertaining. But it matters. It tells us that the Egyptian account as Plato presents it is not just about one forgotten island. It is about an entire forgotten age, a world before the known world, a stretch of history in which recognizable peoples existed in forms later generations no longer remembered properly. That broadens the scope enormously. Plato is not just smuggling in one mysterious island. He is suggesting that the historical horizon of the Greeks is radically incomplete. If that sounds suspiciously convenient for a philosopher who likes using the deep past as a mirror, that is because it is, yet the structure remains fascinating. Many ancient cultures did believe that earlier ages had been greater, closer to gods, or periodically destroyed. The notion of repeated catastrophe is not unique to Plato, and it is not limited to Greece or Egypt. Floods, burnings, darkenings of the sky, sunless periods, and collapsed ages recur all over the ancient world. Most of the time, this tells us more about how human beings process disaster than about a single global event. But it also reminds us that ancient people were perfectly capable of preserving memories of real trauma inside legendary forms. Imagine a major coastal catastrophe remembered across generations without modern chronology, seismology, or academic review. What survives? Not measured sea level curves, not stratigraphic diagrams. What survives is that the sea came where it should not have come. The land was different before. The old people said there used to be settlements farther out. There were walls there once. There was a temple there once. The whole people were punished or tested or drowned. The sky changed. The seasons failed. The great old world ended. That is how memory hardens. When fact and meaning are mixed together for a few hundred or a few thousand years, it becomes morally shaped. It becomes narratively efficient. It stops sounding like a report and starts sounding like myth, even when some portion of it began as lived experience. This is why it is unwise to laugh too quickly at priestly tradition. Not because priests are always right, they are most definitely not. And history has offered us enough priestly certainty to last several civilizations, but because priesthoods in the ancient world often acted as conservators of memory. They held ritual calendars, genealogies, sacred narratives, king associations, festival cycles, and place-based stories. They were among the institutions most invested in continuity. A temple is not a neutral archive, but it is still an archive of a kind. It stores what a culture decides must survive. If Plato wanted to imagine a civilization preserving news of prehistoric disaster, Egyptian priests were a very plausible vessel for that idea. At the same time, mainstream scholarship remains cautious for good reasons. We do not have an Egyptian text from the period clearly describing Atlantis in Plato's terms. No temple inscription has turned up saying in effect, "To whom it may concern, yes, the large ringed island beyond Gibraltar did indeed sink. Please see attached map." That is unfortunate for everyone, especially documentary producers. The Atlantis story comes to us through Plato alone. Everything Egyptian about it is filtered through a Greek literary source written for Greek readers. This means the priestly voice may be partly or largely a Platonic construction shaped to lend authority to the dialogue. That possibility must stay on the table the entire time. Even so, dismissing the priests as pure decoration also feels too simple. Plato's choice reflects a broader truth about Mediterranean memory. Egypt really was older, and Greeks really did look to it as a place where old knowledge might be stored. Greek travelers, writers, and thinkers often treated Egypt as a repository of antiquity. Herodotus did the same in his own way. So whether or not Solon heard the Atlantis story in any historical sense, the cultural logic behind the claim is not absurd. If a Greek were told that somewhere on Earth the deepest records of humanity's forgotten past might be preserved, Egypt would be a natural answer. There is another detail in the priestly exchange that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. The priests explain that Greek traditions survive poorly because catastrophes repeatedly reduce human communities to near beginnings. Survivors in mountainous or less developed regions continue on, but arts, writing, and civic organization are lost, forcing people to start again from simpler conditions. This is an extraordinary little theory of civilizational interruption, not permanent extinction, not total reset, but severe rupture. Enough to erase institutions, enough to produce historical amnesia, enough that later societies might wrongly assume they were closer to the beginning than they really were. One can see why that idea has captured modern imaginations. It sounds very close to certain contemporary questions about prehistory. Could societies have developed in ways not fully preserved? Could coastlines now underwater have supported communities whose traces are difficult to recover? Could some episodes of human sophistication have been regionally erased by climate change, sea level rise, or catastrophe? Could oral memory preserve pieces of those losses while dropping almost everything else? The priests are not offering modern archaeology, but they are offering something structurally similar to a hypothesis of discontinuity. That does not turn Atlantis into fact. It turns Plato into someone who understood how memory breaks. And if memory does break, Egypt becomes even more significant in the story for another reason. The Nile Valley had an unusual relationship with continuity. Egyptian civilization was deeply tied to a river system with regular cycles, stable agricultural foundations, and institutional forms that lasted across very long spans of time, even as dynasties rose and fell. Compared with more seismically active, fragmented, or politically discontinuous regions, Egypt could plausibly appear to later observers as a place where old things lasted. Not forever, not untouched, but long enough to accumulate the impression of historical depth. That impression alone would make Egyptian testimony especially persuasive in a tale about what other peoples had forgotten. Then there is the little matter of numbers, always a good way to complicate a mystery. The priest tells Solon that the war between ancient Athens and Atlantis took place 9,000 years earlier. This is generally where reasonable people throw up their hands, glance at the calendar, and go to make a sandwich. The number is so large by classical standards that it feels intentionally remote. Yet here, too, the priestly setting performs a useful function. Vast chronology sounds more plausible coming from Egypt than from anywhere else in the Greek world. Egypt had dynastic debt. It had old monuments. It had a relationship to time that could absorb huge numbers without immediately collapsing into fantasy. If Plato wanted to place Atlantis in a truly remote age, the Egyptian frame gave him cover. But there may be a deeper reason those numbers matter in the story. Extreme antiquity creates uncertainty. It places the account beyond easy checking. It also creates a mood. We are not dealing with recent politics or remembered war. We are dealing with something half beyond reach, a past old enough to be revered but not entirely grasped. That hazy antiquity is exactly where myths of lost worlds flourish best. They need enough distance to absorb distortion and enough authority to resist complete dismissal. This is where the Egyptian priests start to feel less like narrators and more like a hinge between worlds. On one side there is classical Greece, argumentative, literary, self-aware, philosophically restless. On the other side, there is imagined deep antiquity preserved through temple memory, king lists, and catastrophes older than ordinary tradition. The priests stand in that doorway and say, essentially, your world is not the whole story. Something came before what you remember. Something was lost. Even if Plato invented every word of their speech, he put into their mouths a proposition that has never stopped bothering people. It bothers archaeologists in one way and enthusiasts in another. Enthusiasts tend to hear it and immediately sprint toward hidden civilizations, laser-cut megaliths, impossible navigation, and enough speculative masonry to pave a medium-sized kingdom. Archaeologists hear it and tense up because the statement is both potentially profound and highly vulnerable to abuse. Yes, history is incomplete. Yes, records are fragmentary. Yes, many coastal worlds are gone. No, this does not mean every mystery points to a vanished super-civilization with excellent architecture and regrettable branding. The sensible middle ground is harder to maintain, which is likely why so few people enjoy standing there for long. Still, if we remain in that middle ground for a moment, the priestly account opens several worthwhile questions. What kinds of disasters were ancient peoples remembering when they spoke of worlds broken by water and fire? Were they thinking of local river floods, regional earthquakes, tsunamis, droughts, volcanic eruptions, or some mixture of many events layered together? Did Egyptian traditions include memories, direct or indirect, of climatic upheaval at the end of the Ice Age? Probably not in any simple documentary way, but perhaps in the looser sense that very old stories of disorder, inundation, and prior ages can preserve responses to environmental instability over very long durations. Human beings remember patterns even when they forget dates. That point is easy to underestimate because modern people tend to divide history into categories that feel cleaner than reality. We have myth over here, science over there, religion in another room, history trying very hard to look respectable in the corner, and folklore wandering between them all looking unfairly blamed. Ancient cultures did not separate things that way. A story could preserve land memory, sacred value, political identity, and moral warning all at once. A flood tale could be theological and historical in the same breath. A temple inscription could be ritual language wrapped around a dim recollection of real upheaval. A priestly account could combine sincere tradition, symbolic interpretation, and institutional self-importance without seeing any contradiction in it. Frankly, plenty of modern institutions still manage that trick, only with more email. So when the Egyptian priest tells Solon that old worlds were destroyed and memory thinned out, what we are hearing at minimum is an ancient Mediterranean idea about fragility. Civilization is not guaranteed. Writing is not guaranteed. Continuity is not guaranteed. What survives may survive unevenly. What does survive may survive in forms no later rationalist entirely trusts. That is why Atlantis remains so awkward. The story comes packaged in precisely the sort of medium modern thinking is least comfortable with a philosophically useful legend claiming access to lost history through sacred foreign memory. And yet, if we are honest, that awkwardness is part of its appeal. Atlantis would be far less compelling if it arrived in a cleaner form. If a bronze tablet were dug up tomorrow giving exact coordinates and municipal tax rates, the mystery would be solved and much of the fascination would evaporate. What keeps the subject alive is that we are stuck between possibilities. Plato may have invented a dramatic tale and attached it to Egypt because Egypt sounded old, or he may have drawn, however loosely, from older Mediterranean and Near Eastern ideas about catastrophe, flood, forgotten ages and lost peoples. The Egyptian priests may be a literary mask, or they may preserve a very faint trace of a real habit of placing ancient disaster memory in temple tradition. We do not get certainty, we get tension. That tension leads somewhere important because the more seriously one takes the priestly claim about repeated destructions, the more one is forced to look beyond texts and into the physical history of the planet itself. Were there in fact periods when climate shifted violently enough to traumatize human communities? Were there episodes near the end of the last ice age when rising seas, changing weather, melting ice, and regional catastrophe could have generated the kinds of ancestral memories later cultures turned into stories of flood and lost worlds? Once that question enters the room, Plato's no longer the only source that matters. The discussion moves from philosophy and memory into geology, paleoclimate, and the unstable threshold between the Pleistocene and the world we now live in. That is when Atlantis stops being merely a story about an impossible island and starts brushing up against one of the strangest periods in human prehistory, when the Earth itself seems to have lurched, and a great many old certainties may have gone with it. If Atlantis begins as a story about memory, this is the point where memory meets weather, ice, and a planet that did not behave as politely as later civilizations would have preferred. Because once you move past Plato and his priests and start asking whether the ancient world could really have preserved some blurred recollection of a shattered earlier age, you arrive at one of the strangest intervals in the entire late prehistoric record. Not strange because it proves Atlantis. It does not. Strange because it shows that the Earth itself was capable of abrupt, severe, deeply unsettling change right at the threshold of the modern human world. The Younger Dryas was a cold snap, but calling it a cold snap is a bit like calling a shipwreck a navigational inconvenience. It was a sudden return to near-glacial conditions during the general warming that ended the last ice age. After about 14,500 years ago, Earth had begun shifting out of its colder glacial state, and then roughly 12,900 years before present, that warming was interrupted. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region fell sharply. Conditions in many Northern Hemisphere areas became colder and drier, and this reversal lasted until about 11,700 years ago, when the climate shifted again and the Holocene began. That interval, around 1,200 to 1,300 years long, is what we call the Younger Dryas. It takes its name from Dus octopetala, an Arctic alpine flower whose remains helped identify the cold conditions in European sediments. Even on paper, it is unsettling. Climate is supposed to change slowly, at least in the way most of us imagine it. Ice advances, ice retreats, forests move north, coastlines creep inland, and the whole thing takes place at a pace better suited to geology than gossip. The Younger Dryas reminds us that this comforting picture is incomplete. In Greenland ice cores, some of the changes associated with the end of the Younger Dryas appear astonishingly rapid. Nature papers that helped define this discussion found that the transition into a milder regime in the North Atlantic region may have happened in less than 20 years, with warming in South Greenland of about 7 degrees Celsius completed in roughly 50 years. That is not a typo, and it is not the sort of sentence that allows a civilization to keep all of its habits unchanged while carrying on with business as usual. Now, before anyone gets too excited and starts picturing a single morning in prehistory when everybody opened the door, found the climate broken, and immediately misplaced Atlantis, it is worth slowing down. The Younger Dryas was abrupt by paleoclimate standards, and in some places abrupt by human standards too. But it was not the same thing everywhere, and it was not one perfectly synchronized cinematic event. Its effects varied regionally. Some areas cooled more sharply than others. Some tropical and southern hemisphere records show different expressions and timing. That is one reason scientists still argue carefully about the exact mechanisms and global structure of the event. The broad fact of the Younger Dry is very well established. The details of how it unfolded across different regions are more complicated, which is generally how the real world behaves whenever someone tries to turn it into a simple legend. The leading mainstream explanation is not a lost energy crystal, not a divine punishment for architectural arrogance, and not a secret planetary switch someone leaned on by mistake. It is fresh water, or more precisely, massive meltwater reorganizing the ocean. As the great ice sheets of the last glaciation retreated, large volumes of fresh water were released into northern oceans and drainage systems. That fresh water could reduce surface salinity and density in the North Atlantic, interfering with the overturning circulation that helps transport heat. NOAA's summary of the event and more recent oceanographic work continue to describe the Younger Dryas as widely linked to a disruption or major weakening of Atlantic overturning circulation, though the exact routing, timing, and full trigger sequence remain debated. In other words, the broad mechanism is plausible and strongly supported, even if the plumbing diagram is still being argued over in very serious tones by people who spend more time with sediment cores than most of us spend with our own relatives. That is important because it places the Younger Dryas in the category of real environmental instability rather than tidy myth. The Earth had begun warming out of the Ice Age. Ice sheets were melting, sea level was rising overall, drainage pathways were changing. Then the system lurched. The North Atlantic cooled, weather patterns shifted, sea ice and atmospheric circulation changed. Later the cold period ended with startling speed and warming resumed into the early Holocene. This is not a fantasy of prehistory. It is the sort of thing recorded in ice, ocean sediments, lake deposits, caves, and other paleoclimate archives across large parts of the world. It is one of the clearest examples we have that climate systems can jump rather than stroll. Now imagine living through some part of that, without climatology, without graphs, without a public radio segment featuring a politely worried scientist, and without the luxury of saying, well, perhaps this is a temporary weakening of ocean circulation. You would not know why your world had changed. You would only know that it had. Rivers might behave differently. The air might turn harsher. Growing conditions might fail. Animal ranges might shift. Routes that used to work might become dangerous or useless. Shorelines that your grandparents knew could already have been moving for generations, and then the larger climate background itself would become unstable in a way no one could properly name. The people living through it would not call it the Younger Dryas. They would call it bad years, hungry years, the time the cold returned, the age when the water kept taking land, the season when familiar things stopped being reliable. They would call it what humans always call disaster, whatever language they had for before and after. This is where Atlantis becomes less silly than some people prefer. Not because the Younger Dryas gives us Plato's island, it does not hand us concentric canals royal lineages or a capital city waiting patiently beneath the Atlantic. What it gives us is a believable background for deep cultural memory of catastrophe. It gives us a prehistoric world in which human communities could genuinely have experienced severe environmental upheaval, coastline loss, migration pressure, and repeated disruption. If later traditions preserved flood stories, drowned lands, or accounts of an earlier age destroyed by water and disorder, the younger Dryas does not prove them true in detail, but it does make the existence of such memories more understandable. Sea level is a major part of this, and it deserves its own quiet moment because it is easy to say rising seas and accidentally make it sound like a slow and tidy bathtub. What actually happened after the last glacial maximum was that melting continental ice sheets drove a broad post-glacial rise in sea level that pushed shorelines inland and submerged vast areas of what had once been habitable coastal land. Noah's maritime archaeology material notes that between roughly 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, melting glaciers raised sea levels enough to drown wide coastal zones and the traces of early human activity with them. Continental shelves that now underwater were once exposed landscapes, estuaries, river valleys, caves, rock shelters, hunting grounds, and settlement corridors. Some were likely occupied repeatedly. Many would now be difficult to find and harder still to preserve. That matters a great deal when people argue about missing evidence. The archaeological record is not a perfect census of where humans lived. It is a damaged sample of what remained on land, what was buried under the right conditions, what survived erosion, and what researchers have had the time and budget to find without the sea getting involved. If important late Plein and early Holocene communities were concentrated along coasts, lagoons, estuaries, and shelf edges, then a significant portion of that human landscape now lies underwater. Noah has explicitly framed submerged paleo-landscapes as places where evidence of early human activity may survive, because the low-stand shorelines of the glacial period exposed land now beneath the ocean. So when someone asks whether there could have been coastal societies lost to post-glacial sea rise, the sensible answer is not certainly Atlantis, but of course, some coastal worlds were lost. That is built into the geology. There is another subtle point here that often gets flattened in popular retellings. The younger Dryas itself was not simply a flood event. It was a climate reversal within a longer deglacial transition. Sea levels had already been rising before it, and continued to rise after it, though the rates varied and the pattern was not uniform everywhere. Science work on Tahiti sea level records found that sea level rise slowed during the younger Dryas and accelerated again into the Holocene. That may sound less dramatic than the sea swallowed the world in a night, but in one sense it is more useful because real memory often forms from repeated pressure, not just one giant shock. Human communities could have spent generations adapting to moving shorelines and shifting climates, then later condense those experiences into simpler stories about lands lost to water. This is one reason it is a mistake to imagine prehistoric catastrophe only as a single dramatic blow. Sometimes there is a blow, certainly. A tsunami will convince anyone to respect the sea in very short order. A volcanic eruption can rewrite a region in an afternoon, but long-term destabilization may be just as culturally powerful. A coastline that retreats over many generations still produces elders who remember places now underwater. An estuary that salinizes or a river mouth that shifts still breaks continuity. A fishing ground lost, a burial place drowned, a settlement abandoned, a route cut off. These things enter memory. They can later be compressed. They can be moralized. They can be attached to kings and gods and old names. They do not have to survive as exact measurements to remain historically real in a human sense. The younger Dryas also sits near another great prehistoric puzzle, the reshaping of human and animal worlds at the end of the Pliocene. Large mammals disappeared across many regions. Human populations adapted, moved, and reconfigured. Archaeological patterns shift. But again, reality resists tidy storytelling. There is no single universally accepted cause for all late Plein megafaunal extinctions. And current research treats climate change, ecological disruption, and human pressures as interacting factors rather than a one-button explanation. That is relevant because Atlantis discussions often attract people who want one grand event to explain everything at once. Real prehistory is almost never that accommodating. It is layered, Climate stress matters, human adaptation matters, geography matters, timing matters. Sometimes the honest answer is not. This one cause explains all. But several bad things happened in overlapping ways, and the living memory of them would have been messy. And then, inevitably, we arrive at the impact hypothesis, because any discussion of the Younger Dryas in popular culture now has to pass through that particular room, if only to turn the lights off before leaving. The Younger impact hypothesis argues that an extraterrestrial impact or airburst around 12,800 years ago triggered the cooling, biomass burning, ecological change, and other disruptions associated with the Younger DUS onset. Some papers have reported markers they interpret as evidence of such an event, including platinum anomalies and high-temperature materials. Other researchers have challenged the chronology, the interpretation of the markers, and the broader causal claims. A 2014 PNAS critique stated that there was no compelling reason to accept the claim that a cosmic impact caused the Younger Dryas, and debates over nanodiamonds, microspherals, and dating have continued for years. The fair summary is that the impact idea remains controversial and is not the mainstream explanation for the Younger Dryas itself. That probably disappoints the sort of person who likes every ancient mystery to come with a fireball, but it also helps us keep our footing. We do not need a comet to make the lake glacial world dramatic. Ice sheets, meltwater, ocean circulation shifts, and drowning coastlines are more than enough. The planet was already capable of being extremely rude all on its own. Sometimes restraint is the more interesting story. If a civilization or network of communities had existed on vulnerable coasts during this broad era, then a changing world of shifting shorelines and unstable climate would be fully capable of erasing a great deal without any celestial assistance whatsoever. Nature, when sufficiently motivated, rarely requires special effects. Another reason the Younger Dryas matters for the Atlantis question is that it attacks a very old assumption, one that still lingers around the edges of public thinking. The assumption is that deep prehistory was simple, empty, and fundamentally uneventful until recognizable civilization arrived and made proper use of stone. But by the time the Younger DUS begins, human beings had already spread widely, adapted to diverse environments, developed tool traditions, symbolic behavior, exchange networks, and regionally complex lifeways. They were not waiting in a queue for history to begin. They were already living it. That means climate instability at the end of the Ice Age was not happening to vague generic primitives. It was happening to real human communities with territories, memory, skills, and attachments to place. The losses would have been human losses, not just geological ones. One can go too far with that idea, of course. Atlantis enthusiasts often take one reasonable statement, such as late Plene, humans were more capable than older stereotypes allowed, and immediately inflate it into therefore there was a globe-spanning super-civilization with advanced astronomy and excellent maritime zoning. There is a large and rather silly leap in the middle there. The Younger Dryas does not imply a hidden high civilization in the way some fringe theories imagine. What it does imply is that any strict smug boundary between real history and everything before it was negligible is not especially safe. Human beings were present, organized, and adaptable. Their environments were changing. Some of their preferred lands are now underwater. That combination alone is enough to justify caution whenever someone declares the prehistoric record complete. There is also something psychologically important about the Younger Dryas, and perhaps this is where it comes closest to the emotional logic of Atlantis. It is a story about interrupted expectation. The world was warming, then it cooled. Stability seemed to be emerging, then it faltered. That pattern leaves a mark. Human beings can endure hardship more readily when it behaves consistently. A cold world is harsh, but at least it is honest about being cold. A changing world that seems to improve and then suddenly turns again is harder to build confidence inside. If later stories remembered a prior age ending in disorder, that emotional structure would fit very well with the late glacial transition. Not a paradise destroyed in one theatrical instant, perhaps, but a world made unreliable, then lost. And if you allow yourself one modest speculation, not the reckless sort that decorates every rock with Atlantan heritage, but the quieter, more disciplined kind, you can begin to see how a tale of a drowned old world might eventually form. First, there are real coasts, now vanished. Then there are real climate shocks, now reconstructed in cores and isotopes. Then there are displaced groups, interrupted traditions, and elders telling the young that the shoreline was elsewhere once, that the sea took fields, that colder years came back after warmth, that old settlements lay beyond the current coast. Give that enough time, add migration, add ritual, add sacred storytelling, add one or two ambitious literate cultures who preserve fragments from their neighbors and predecessors. Eventually, someone writes down a memory that is no longer only memory. It is instruction, warning, identity, and history kneaded together until nobody can cleanly separate the ingredients. That does not produce Atlantis by itself. It produces something more interesting, a world capable of generating Atlantis. And that, I think, is the real importance of the younger Deus in this larger story. It does not tell us where Plato's island was. It does not confirm the reef structure, validate every submerged ruin on social media, or prove that some magnificent Ice Age port is waiting offshore for a camera crew and a triumphant soundtrack. What it does is remove the lazy objection that prehistory was too dull, too stable, or too unsophisticated to leave behind memories of lost lands and broken ages. The Earth did shudder in climate terms. Coasts did drown. Human landscapes did vanish. Memory would have had plenty to work with. Once that becomes clear, another pattern starts to look less like coincidence and more like something worth paying attention to. Because if a broken climate and rising water really did leave scars on ancient memory, then we should expect later cultures to talk about it. Not in the language of ocean circulation and isotopes, but in stories. Stories about floods, wiped out peoples, rescued survivors, angry gods, mountains, boats, drowned planes, and old worlds that ended badly. And that is exactly where the trail leads next, into the long, crowded, very human business of trying to remember disaster after the facts have gone missing. One of the quickest ways to make Atlantis feel less like an isolated curiosity and more like part of a much older pattern is to look at what ancient people kept saying about water, again and again, in very different places. Stories begin with a world that has gone wrong and a flood that resets it. Not always the same flood, not always the same God, not always the same moral lesson, and certainly not always the same landscape. But the recurrence is striking enough that people have been arguing over it for centuries. Some take it as proof that all humanity preserved the memory of one global catastrophe. Others dismiss the whole pattern as a coincidence produced by the fact that human beings like dramatic stories and tend to build their lives near rivers and coasts, which are unfortunately the exact places most likely to become dramatic. The sensible position, as usual, is less tidy and more interesting than either extreme. Flood myths are widespread, especially across Eurasia and the Americas, but they are not uniform and their differences matter as much as their similarities. If you read them too quickly, they blur together. A righteous survivor is warned, a vessel is built, animals or seeds or family members are gathered. The waters come. Most of the world dies. The waters retreat. A new beginning follows. It is a structure so familiar now that it can feel almost generic, as though humanity accidentally invented the same disaster screenplay in different languages, because apparently we all agreed the sea was an excellent editor. But once you slow down, the variety becomes impossible to ignore. In some stories, the flood is punishment for human corruption. In others, it is the result of divine disagreement, cosmic reset, or a cycle of worlds ending and beginning. Sometimes the survivors are virtuous. Sometimes they are simply favored, warned, lucky, or unusually attentive to fish. Sometimes the flood is universal in tone. Sometimes it feels much more local, attached to one people, one plain, one valley, one remembered coastline. The Mesopotamian material is usually where any serious discussion has to begin. Not because Mesopotamia invented the idea of flooding. Rivers manage that quite independently, but because some of the oldest written flood narratives come from there. In the Sumerian Eridu Genesis, Zeus Sudra survives a god-sent flood after being warned by Enki. In later Babylonian tradition, Atrahasis is warned to build a ship. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he preserved life in a great boat and became the survivor of the mythological deluge. Britannica's summary is quite direct here. The Mesopotamian versions include features later familiar from Genesis, including the building and provisioning of the ark and the dispatch of birds. That does not mean every later flood story is copied line by line from Mesopotamia. But it does mean the ancient Near East already possessed a very old, literate and influential flood tradition, long before modern people started talking about Atlantis on television with suspiciously intense background music. The biblical story of Noah is the most famous of these for many readers, but it is also one of the clearest examples of how a flood narrative can preserve an inherited structure while changing its theology. In Genesis, Noah survives, not because the gods are arguing or because one deity quietly slips in the plans, but because one God judges human corruption and chooses a righteous man to preserve life. Britannica notes that the Hebrew account shares tangible similarities with Mesopotamian flood stories, while also reshaping them into a monotheistic frame where the destruction is morally grounded and the rainbow marks a covenant never again to destroy the earth that way. In other words, the flood remains, but the meaning changes. The story is not simply about survival, it becomes about justice, judgment, and renewed order. Greece, meanwhile, gives us Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survive when Zeus decides to destroy humanity by flood. Here again, the broad structure is familiar, but the surrounding logic is distinctly Greek. Deucalion is linked to Prometheus. The flood is tied to divine displeasure, and after survival comes an act of repopuling the world in one of mythology's more memorable turns, with stones cast behind them becoming men and women. The details vary across retellings, but the important point is that the Greek world did not merely inherit a flood idea and leave it untouched. It adapted it, attached it to its own mythic genealogy, and made it part of its own account of destruction and renewal. That matters for Atlantis because it reminds us that Greek culture was already comfortable thinking in terms of worlds broken by water before Plato ever sat down to write. India offers another version through Manu. Warned by a fish that a flood will destroy humanity, he builds a boat, ties it to the fish's horn, survives, and becomes the ancestor of renewed humankind. In later tradition, the fish is identified with Matsya, an avatar of Vishnu. Once more, the structure is recognizable and the meaning is local. The flood does not prove a single common source by itself. It proves that stories of overwhelming water were useful, memorable, and adaptable across civilizations. It also shows how such stories absorb the values of the cultures that carry them. In one place, the flood confirms covenant. In another, it confirms divine hierarchy. Elsewhere, it validates kingship, ritual, renewal, or the moral failures of a previous age. Water destroys, but it also authorizes what comes next. That last point is easy to miss if you only focus on the disaster itself. Flood stories are not just about what was lost, they're also about who gets to begin again. This is one reason they are so durable. A flood wipes the board clean in narrative terms. It explains why the old order disappeared, and why the present order deserves legitimacy. The survivors become ancestors, the rescued knowledge becomes sacred, the vessel becomes proof of favor, obedience, cleverness, or foresight. If a culture wants to imagine a hard break between a corrupted before and a more ordered after, flood is a very efficient mechanism. It is terrifying, morally flexible, and geographically plausible in almost every place humans choose to live. Rivers overflow, seas rise, storms surge, deltas shift, lakes burst their margins. The symbolism works because the physical hazard is already close at hand. That is also why there are many flood myths is not by itself an argument for one universal event. Human beings do not need a single shared catastrophe to produce stories about catastrophic water. They need coastlines, rivers, weather, memory, and a tendency to turn danger into narrative. Flood is one of the most common natural hazards on Earth, and humans have repeatedly chosen floodplains, river mouths, deltas, estuaries, and coastlines as places to settle because they are fertile, connected, and productive, right up until they become deeply unhelpful. Nature Communications published a long historical study showing that even in documented societies, communities tend to settle more cautiously after catastrophic floods for one generation, then drift back toward risk by the second generation as direct memory fades. That is a useful caution. Raw flood memory decays surprisingly fast unless something keeps it alive. And that, oddly enough, is where the flood myth question becomes more interesting rather than less. If ordinary practical memory fades within a generation or two, then stories that endure for very long periods probably do not survive as plain eyewitness recall. They survive because they become culturally important. They get attached to sacred places, ritual language, kinship, origin stories, tabos, migration routes, or recurring performances. They stop being what happened that year and become what our people know about how the world can end. That change makes them less precise and more durable. Dates vanish, measurements vanish, the moral frame thickens, the geography may compress, yet some kernel, especially if it is tied to a specific coastline or submerged place, can remain stubbornly alive. Nature's study is actually helpful here, because it shows why transmission needs reinforcement. Long memory does not persist by accident. This is where recent work on oral traditions and post-glacial sea level rise becomes relevant, because it demonstrates that under certain conditions, human communities really can preserve memories of changing coastlines over extraordinary spans of time. A 2022 Quaternary International paper on Lake Quaternary coastal change argues that some culturally grounded stories from Australia and northwest Europe plausibly recollect coastal submergence, land loss, and isolation linked to post-glacial sea level rise. The authors note that after the last ice age, the ocean rose about 120 meters along much of the world's coastline, and that in some places, people appear to have encoded observations of land loss into oral tradition. A 2023 Journal of Archaeological Science paper on Tasmanian Aboriginal traditions goes even further, arguing that some traditions describing the flooding of the Bashan land bridge may preserve memory with roots reaching back to the end of the late Pleistocene, around 12,000 years ago. These are not proofs of Atlantis, of course, but they are powerful evidence that the old smug dismissal, people could never remember anything that long is not as safe as it once sounded. Still, caution matters here too. The existence of long-lived oral memory in some cases does not mean every flood myth everywhere is a deep-time record of real sea level rise. Some are plainly theological, some are literary, some are political. Some are likely patchworks of many flood experiences layered together over centuries. The point is not that all myths are history in disguise. The point is that history, especially environmental history, can survive in mythic form when direct documentary continuity is absent. That is a very different claim and a much more defensible one. If a people say there used to be land where the sea is now, and geology agrees that such land existed and was inundated, we do not need to pretend the story is a scientific paper in order to acknowledge that it may preserve something real. Now bring that back to Atlantis and the picture sharpens a little. Plato's story is not just another flood myth. It is much more specific, much more political, much more shaped by philosophical concerns. But it sits in a world where flood stories were already old, widespread, and meaningful. It sits in a Mediterranean and Near Eastern context, where people knew rivers could destroy cities, seas could remove coastlines, and older civilizations often framed destruction as moral reset. It also sits downstream in a cultural sense from the broader post-glacial reality that large tracts of once inhabited coast had vanished beneath rising seas. That does not make Atlantis true. It does make Atlantis culturally legible. Plato's readers were not being asked to imagine something utterly alien. They were being asked to imagine a lost world in a flood-haunted civilizational tradition. There is another reason water dominates these beginnings, and it has less to do with physical hazard than with how the human mind organizes fear. Fire is dramatic, but it is local unless it spreads. Earthquakes are terrifying, but they strike and pass. Water changes boundaries. Water makes maps untrustworthy. Water can arrive suddenly in a flood or slowly through sea level rise, and in either case, it rewrites where home is. It takes fields, roads, graves, harbors, fishing grounds, and landmarks. It can leave survivors with the very peculiar experience of knowing exactly where something used to be, while being unable to go there anymore because it is under a moving reflective surface full of fish who are, to be fair, not especially interested in your ancestral rites. That kind of loss is excellent material for long memory because it is spatial. It can be pointed to out there beneath that bay beyond those breakers where the old people said the land once continued. And because flood stories are spatial, they often preserve more than one kind of truth at once. A flood tale can be morally exaggerated and geographically anchored. It can attribute an event to divine anger and still preserve a real valley, river mouth, or drowned shelf. It can be wrong about cause and right about consequence. This is one of the biggest mistakes in modern argument about myths. People assume the story must be either literally factual or entirely useless, but ancient storytelling does not work that way. A narrative can distort mechanism, compress chronology, and intensify scale, while still pointing toward a real vulnerability in the world. The sea came in, the land changed, a people moved, a city was damaged, the old order ended. From there, the culture does what cultures do. It shapes the event into meaning. Mesopotamia is a very good example of this because it is both mythically rich and physically flood-prone. Southern Mesopotamia was built in an alluvial environment of rivers, channels, marshes, and shifting water systems. The old stories from that region do not need a global memory to explain why flood became such a potent image. People there lived with water as blessing, transport, fertility, and threat. Annual inundation and catastrophic overflow are close neighbors in places like that. The flood in the text becomes cosmic, but one can easily see how a river civilization would find water, the obvious medium for divinical destruction. It is the local hazard scaled upward into myth that does not reduce its significance. If anything, it helps explain why the form was so transportable into other traditions. Egypt is a useful contrast. Egyptian civilization was also built on a river, but the Nile flood was ordinarily a source of life, not annihilation. The annual inundation structured agriculture and even the calendar. So, while Egypt certainly knew dangerous water and remembered episodes of disorder, its core relationship to flooding was not identical to Mesopotamia's. That is worth remembering because it prevents us from flattening all ancient water stories into one emotional tone. The same element can signify chaos in one setting and renewal in another. When Plato links Atlantis memory to Egypt, he is therefore doing something interesting. He places a story of catastrophic submergence in the mouth of a civilization whose prestige came partly from long continuity along a river that usually behaved as the opposite of total destruction. It is one more reason the Egyptian framing feels deliberate. Then there is the wider Atlantic and European fringe, which brings us closer to the emotional atmosphere Atlantis later occupied. In northwest Europe, there are long-standing traditions of drowned lands, sunken forests, and territories lost to the sea. The 2022 Quaternary International paper explicitly discusses stories from Australia and northwest Europe that plausibly recollect coastal submergence, land loss, and isolation. Some of these stories need not reach back to the end of the Ice Age to matter. A lower, flatter coast can disappear in stages over historical and late prehistoric time, and the result is exactly the sort of thing communities remember. A church bell beneath the waves, a road now under a bay, a forest visible at low tide, a former crossing now open water. Those are the small cousins of Atlantis. And in some ways they are more convincing because they are ordinary. They show how easily drowned land traditions arise, where the coast is unstable enough to teach the lesson directly. This is the point where some people become impatient and say, all right, then are flood myths evidence or not? The honest answer is that they are evidence of several things at once. They are evidence that human beings repeatedly experience destructive water. They are evidence that societies encode environmental danger into stories. They're evidence that memory survives best when tied to cultural importance. In some cases, especially where stories map onto known coastal change, they may be evidence of genuine observations of submergence transmitted over very long spans. What they are not is a shortcut around all other kinds of inquiry. A myth is not a biometric survey. It cannot tell us by itself where Atlantis was, whether a specific underwater formation is a city, or whether every impressive ancient stone wall should be blamed on one vanished maritime empire with excellent branding and terrible luck. Yet, flood memory still changes the Atlantis discussion in one important way. It makes the core idea less ridiculous, not the fully decorated version with impossible engineering and polished moral symmetry, but the simpler possibility underneath it that stories of old lands lost to water might preserve dim memories of real prehistoric or ancient losses. Once you admit that such memory is at least possible under the right cultural conditions, Atlantis stops being a binary question and becomes a spectrum. At one end lies Plato's crafted literary island. At the other lies the very real fact that coastlines drowned, communities moved, and some of those changes were remembered. The most interesting possibilities live somewhere between those ends where memory, myth, and history overlap just enough to become difficult. And that difficult middle ground brings us to a more practical question. Suppose ancient people really did carry memories of disaster and drowned landscapes. Suppose some stories preserve more truth than we once thought. What kind of actual human world stood on the edge of those changes? What were people building, believing, and organizing near the end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene? Because if flood memory survived, then somewhere behind it, there had to be society substantial enough to lose places worth remembering. That is where the conversation leaves myth for a moment and turns towards stone toward a site in southeastern Anatolia that arrived like a polite little scandal in archaeology and forced people to rethink how early complex ritual and large-scale building could appear. Once Göbekli enters the picture, the old claim that civilization came late, and in a neat, orderly sequence, begins to wobble in a very interesting way. Göbekli is where the old, comfortable version of prehistory starts to come apart. The site in southeastern Turkey near Şanlıurfa dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic and is generally placed between roughly 9,600 and 8,200 billions CE, with the earliest monumental phase in the 10th millennium BCE. UNESCO describes it as a complex of monumental round, oval, and rectangular megalithic structures erected by hunter-gatherers, and the German Archaeological Institute places its main occupation broadly in the range of about 950 250 to 7,750 Cal BC. That alone is enough to make people sit up a little straighter, because it means Göbekli belongs to a moment astonishingly early in the transition from hunting and gathering to farming economies in Upper Mesopotamia. For a very long time, the popular story of early civilization was arranged in a reassuring sequence. First people settled down, then they farmed. Then, with surplus food and permanent communities, they developed specialists, hierarchies, monuments, temples, and all the heavier furniture of civilization. Göbekli was so disruptive because it seemed to scramble that order. Here were monumental structures raised by communities that are still described in the main institutional summaries as hunter-gatherers, not by literate city dwellers or mature agricultural states. UNESCO's inscription explicitly treats the site as one of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture, and ties it to societies living during the transition from hunter-gatherer subsistence to the first farming communities. In other words, the sequence did not vanish, but it stopped looking neat. That is why the phrase civilization arriving too early is both useful and misleading. Useful, because it captures the shock people feel when they see very early foragers or semi-edentary communities producing architecture on a scale they were not supposed to manage. Misleading because Göbekli Tepe is not a city, not a state, not a writing culture, and not evidence of a lost high civilization in the extravagant Atlantis Channel sense. The site sits much closer to the beginning of village life than to anything like Uruk or Egypt. Lee Clare's 2020 summary for the DAI describes Göbekli as belonging to an early stage in the transition from hunter-gathering to farming, and current institutional language emphasizes that older media images of the place as home to the world's first temples now need revision. The problem then is not that full civilization suddenly appears where it should not. The problem is that our categories were too stiff. The site itself is not shy about making an impression. UNESCO's technical description notes monumental round, oval enclosures between about 10 and 30 meters wide, ringed with distinctive T-shaped monolithic pillars. Those pillars are generally between 3 and 5 meters high, with some central examples reaching up to 5 meters, and many are decorated with carved imagery. The carvings are strikingly dominated by wild animals rather than domestic ones: snakes, boa, birds of prey, foxes, aurochs, and other powerful or dangerous creatures. Human imagery is comparatively restrained, though some of the pillars are widely interpreted as anthropomorphic, and the DII's own presentation describes the T-Illars as stylized human beings. Even before you ask what the site meant, you can already see that it demanded planning, quarrying, transport, labor coordination, and a symbolic world elaborate enough to justify all of that effort. The first generation of interpretation leaned very heavily toward the ritual side, and there were good reasons for that. Klaus Schmidt and others brought the site to worldwide attention as something like a mountain sanctuary or ritual center, a place whose monumental enclosures look so unlike the expected architecture of ordinary domestic life that special buildings, sanctuaries, and even temples became common language around them. UNESCO still says the monuments were probably used in connection with rituals, most likely of airy nature, and the 2018 advisory material speaks of public ritual and feasting. It is not hard to see why this reading became popular. If you uncover giant decorated pillars on a hilltop, and the whole arrangement looks formal, theatrical, and symbolically charged, ritual center is a very tempting first answer. But Göbekli became even more important once that first answer stopped being sufficient. The German Archaeological Institute now says plainly that the earlier interpretation as a primarily ritual site or mountain shrine has to be set in a much more complex context. New excavation results, according to the DAI project page, have produced clear evidence of domestic activities and indications of a permanent settlement, leading the team to interpret Göbekli not as a pure sanctuary detached from everyday life, but as a settlement site with a pronounced ritual component. CLA's 2020 research summary says the same thing in more careful academic language, noting that recent excavation and re-evaluation challenge the old media narrative of the world's first temples. That shift matters enormously. The site is no longer most responsibly described as a mysterious sacred place, visited only occasionally by bands of nomads. It looks more like a lived-in place where ritual and daily life were deeply entangled. That change in interpretation actually makes Göbekli more impressive rather than less. A pure shrine is strange enough. A settlement capable of producing and maintaining this scale of symbolic architecture is stranger because it tells us not just that early Neolithic communities could build monuments, but that they may have woven monumentality into ordinary social life much earlier than older models like to admit. UNESCO's nomination report already hinted at this by noting nearby structures of lesser architectural complexity that might be termed domestic. While the DAI now states that there is clear evidence of domestic activities, instead of a simple split between holy place and village, the emerging picture is one in which those categories may not have been cleanly separable at all. For the people who built Gobalati, a building could be communal, symbolic, socially charged, and still belong to the world of settlement rather than standing outside it. Food is one of the best clues to how all this worked, because monumental architecture is not raised on symbolism alone. The 2019 serial processing study in +1 examined more than 7,000 grinding-related artifacts from the site and found unusually abundant evidence for standardized tools used to process cereals. The authors concluded that cereals were present in significant quantities and that food processing had clearly been a major concern at Gobashipa. They also note that the organization of work and food supply is central to understanding the site, since construction and maintenance of the monumental architecture would have required a considerable workforce. That matters because it shifts the discussion away from vague admiration and toward logistics. Somebody had to feed the people moving stone, carving pillars, preparing spaces, and participating in whatever social events kept the whole system going. The food evidence also pushes against the old caricature that these builders were merely drifting hunter-gatherers who occasionally wandered onto a hill and became unexpectedly architectural. The DAI's own discussion of cereals, feasts, and monuments argues that the site shows evidence consistent with large work feasts, and it links the plant food record to earlier zoo archaeological signs of large-scale hunting, especially migratory gazelle. The same DI discussion notes that Gerbasipi has several likely contemporary special buildings rather than a single one, and suggests that different groups may have used different monumental structures marked by different emblematic animals. That is a much denser social picture than the older, simpler story. It implies repeated gatherings, patterned identities, planned food production or preparation for immediate consumption, and the kind of coordination that makes it harder to speak of early Neolithic people as socially simple. There is a practical side to this that I find especially revealing. Gobeshi sits on a high ridge in the Gish Mountains, a location that is visually commanding but not especially friendly in everyday terms. The DI notes that the nearest accessible springs are about 5 kilometers away, and an official Tepe telegrams post says the ridge is unusual compared with contemporaneous settlements which were normally positioned near water sources. The same source says pits on the western slope could represent rainwater systems, though their exact date is uncertain, and that their capacity may have allowed people to stay for extended periods, even if not through the whole dry summer. So the site's builders were not simply choosing the easiest place to live. They were investing in a difficult location and likely solving practical problems in order to keep using it. That is often a sign that the place mattered for more than subsistence alone. Then there is the odd and very deliberate issue of burial, not of people, but of buildings. UNESCO's documentation says the monumental enclosures of the earlier phase appear to have been intentionally backfilled with limestone rubble, flint debris, animal bone, and other material, and that later smaller rectangular rooms associated with pre-pottery Neolithic B were built in parts of the tell. The same report describes the visible remains as the result of several centuries of construction, reconstruction, dismantling, reuse, and transformation. This is not the pattern of a site that flared up once and then simply failed. It is a place with a long internal history where buildings were emptied, filled, replaced, and reworked across generations that gives the architecture a social life of its own. These enclosures were not just erected, they were managed, retired, transformed, and remembered. The human dimension becomes stranger still when you look at the treatment of the dead. A Science Advances study reported carved and drilled skull fragments from Göbekli Tepe, describing them as evidence for a previously undocumented variation of skull cult in the early Neolithic of Anatolia and the Levant. The researchers note that although formal burials are absent at the site, fragmented human bones were recovered from fills in adjacent areas, and that the marked skull fragments provide the first osteological evidence for treatment of the dead at Göbekli Tepe. One should be careful here. Skull cult is a technical and loaded phrase, and the precise meanings remain debated. But even in the narrowest reading, the evidence tells us that symbolic and ritual engagement with human remains was part of the site's world. This was not merely a place of quarrying and feasting. It was a place where the living, animals, monuments, and the dead may all have been drawn into the same social field. Once you put all of that together, the real lesson of Göbekli becomes clearer. It does not show us an impossible civilization arriving intact out of nowhere. It shows us that monumentality, symbolism, technical skill, and large-scale communal organization can arise before cities, before writing, and before the kind of fully developed farming states people used to imagine as necessary preconditions. UNESCO's criteria language explicitly says the site's communities lived during the transition from hunter-gatherer subsistence to the first farmers, and that the architecture may point to specialized craftsmen and possibly more hierarchical forms of society. That is a careful statement, and it is better than the sensational one. The site does not collapse the distinction between foragers and states. It reveals a broad and complicated middle ground, where social complexity was already developing, in forms older textbooks did not handle very well. This is exactly why Göbekli became so important to Atlantis-style thinking, even when responsible archaeologists want nothing to do with the wilder conclusions. If people in the 10th and 9th millennia BCE were capable of organizing labor, building massive carved enclosures, processing food on a large scale, and maintaining symbolically dense communal spaces, then the older image of late Ice Age and early post-Ice Age humanity as culturally slight begins to look very poor. That does not mean Plato was describing Gebesipe, and it certainly does not mean there was a drowned global super-civilization waiting offshore with matching decor. It means only that the deep past had more capacity in it than many older narratives allowed. Once that becomes obvious, the phrase too early stops being a statement about the people and starts sounding more like a confession about us. We were late in adjusting our expectations. It also forces a more disciplined kind of humility. The site does not prove that religion created agriculture, though that was one of the bold early suggestions associated with it. It has not proved that all early monumentality was ritual in the narrow sense because current research now insists on domestic activity and settlement. It has not proved the existence of a vanished advanced civilization erased by catastrophe. What it has done is much more valuable than any of those convenient slogans. It has shown that the emergence of complex social behavior, communal labor, symbolic architecture, and new forms of leadership in the early Holocene was experimentally messy, regionally varied, and earlier than the old linear story suggested. CLA's current research framing even ties Göbekli to crisis, social change, and charismatic leadership among hunter-gatherers, which is a far subtler picture than First Temple or First Civilization. And perhaps that is the reason Göbekli keeps exerting such a pull on the imagination. It does not give us Atlantis, but it does remove one of the laziest objections people used to throw at any deep prehistoric mystery, which was that ancient people that far back simply could not have organized much of consequence. They could, they did. The site on the hill proves at minimum that early Neolithic societies in Upper Mesopotamia were capable of monumentality, persistent symbolic systems, and social coordination on a scale no one would have confidently assigned them a century ago. Once you accept that, the map of the ancient world changes a little. The oldest past becomes less empty, less childish, less obedient to the tidy march from cave to city. And once that happens, people naturally begin looking elsewhere, not just at stones on Origin Anatolia, but at strange landforms, drowned margins, and places that seem to invite the dangerous question all over again. If a site like this could wait in plain sight until the 20th century to fully unsettle us, what else have we been staring at without really seeing? Hisha structure is the kind of place that makes restraint feel almost unfair. You look at it once from above, and every patient, disciplined part of the mind immediately has to compete with the much louder part that says, well, now hold on, that really does look like something. Not just anything either. It looks like design. It looks like intention. It looks like a vast target, a buried city plan, a forgotten diagram stamped onto the Sahara by some hand that clearly preferred circles and had absolutely no interest in subtlety. ESA has described it as a circular eye of Africa, easier to appreciate from space than from the ground. And that detail matters more than it may seem at first, because the Risha structure is one of those features whose mystery begins with perspective. From the surface, it is terrain. From orbit, it is a symbol. That is the first reason Atlantis attaches itself to Risha so stubbornly. Plato gives us concentric rings of land and water. The Sahara gives us a giant circular formation with nested rings visible from space. Once those two images are placed side by side, a certain kind of imagination does not need much more encouragement. Add the fact that the structure sits in Mauritania, out in the broad western reaches of North Africa, and the old phrase "beyond the pillars of Heracles" begins to hum in people's heads again. Had the Green Sahara, the now well-supported idea that the desert was much wetter and more vegetated during past humid phases, including the African humid period, and suddenly what is now a dry inland geological wonder starts to feel in some people's minds like the fossilized center of a lost world that merely waited for satellites to reveal it. The appeal is obvious, it is neat, it is dramatic, it feels like a solution hiding in plain sight. And yet, as with Atlantis in general, the trouble begins the moment you stop looking only at the shape and start asking what the thing actually is. Geologically, the Risha structure is not an urban ruin, not a drowned harbor, and not the eroded footprint of a civilization. Current geological work describes it as a large eroded dome and complex igneous structure. IUGs, which included the site among its geo-heritage selections, describes Risha as a slightly elliptical depression, about 40 kilometers across, marked by concentric ridges of very old sedimentary strata with a central megabreccia, and intrusive igneous components including gabbroic ring dikes, chymolytic intrusions, and alkaline volcanic rocks. A 2024 Lithos paper says even more plainly that the Risha structure is now consensually recognized as a complex igneous intrusion involving ring-like gabbric bodies, a central bria and carbonatite dikes with later uplift and erosion producing the flattened concentric form we see today. In other words, the circles are real, but they are geological circles. They are not walls, they are not canals, they are not the weathered bones of a city plan. That shift from appearance to process is the whole story here. And it is also the moment when Atlantis believers usually become a little less cheerful because the Rish structure is genuinely extraordinary. It just happens to be extraordinary in the wrong way for Atlantis. The 2014 Journal of African Earth Sciences paper describes it as at least 40 kilometers in diameter, with volcanic and intrusive rocks exposed at different erosion levels, all enclosed within older Proterozoic and Paleozoic sediments. The 2024 Lithos study adds that the structure formed through at least two magmatic events, separated by roughly 100 million years, with gabbros likely related to the Central Atlantic magmatic province around 200 million years ago, and later alkaline intrusion causing local doming around 100 million years later. Then erosion did the rest. This is magnificent geology. It is terrible news for anyone hoping the rings were cut. Canals surrounding a royal capital. One of the strongest reasons the Risha theory spread anyway is that people often confuse resemblance with fit. Plato's city as commonly imagined has concentric rings. Risha has concentric rings. That is the resemblance. But resemblance is only the beginning of identification, not the end of it. Plato's Atlantis is an island. Risha is a landlocked geological feature in central Mauritania. Plato's Atlantis is associated with harbors and navigable channels. Risha's rings are ridges and valleys produced by differential erosion, acting on uplifted and intruded rock layers. Plato's Atlantis is destroyed in a cataclysm and sinks. Risha, by contrast, is a structure whose very visibility depends on long-term uplift, intrusion, and erosion over immense spans of geological time. The more specific the comparison becomes, the less convincing it is. The match is strongest in the one place where visual pattern seduces the mind most easily, the satellite image. Beyond that, the fit weakens quickly. This is also why the phrase, hiding in plain sight, is so tempting. Rish really does hide in plain sight in one sense. ESA notes that it is easier to observe from space than from the ground, and astronauts have used it as a familiar landmark since early manned missions. That alone gives it a strangely modern aura, as though the place was waiting for orbital vision before it could properly enter human imagination. Ancient people could have walked through parts of it without ever seeing the full geometry. Modern satellite culture, on the other hand, turns it instantly into iconography. It becomes a symbol before it becomes a sight. And symbols are dangerous things around old mysteries. Because once a place starts looking meaningful from the air, a great many people become unwilling to let geology have the final word. Then there is the Green Sahara problem, which is a real problem, but not in the way Atlantis enthusiasts usually hope. Modern paleoclimate research is very clear that the Sahara was not always the hyper-arid desert we know today. Reviews of the African humid period describe a much wetter and more vegetated North Africa, especially during the early to middle Holocene, with lakes, rivers, stronger monsoons, and substantial ecological change. Nature Communications notes the dramatic shift from a humid green Sahara to modern hyperaridity around 5%. 5,000 years ago, and broader review work describes repeated humid periods in which the desert was far more habitable than today. That is crucial because it means Rishi did not always sit in the same lifeless-looking environment our eyes now associate with it. There were wetter phases, more water, more life, and more human movement across Sahara landscapes. But greener does not mean maritime. Wetter does not mean Atlantis. A habitable Sahara is not the same thing as a sunken Atlantic island. This distinction matters because a great deal of Risha-Atlantis speculation depends on a quiet sleight of hand. First, one notes correctly that the Sahara used to be greener and more watered. Then, without admitting the jump, one begins talking as if this somehow makes rich air a coastal city or a former oceanic basin. But the actual Green Sahara literature speaks about humid periods, vegetation, lakes, rivers, and monsoon-driven landscape change. It does not transform the rash structure into the kind of seaborne island power Plato describes. The desert's climatic history makes Rashat more plausible as a place humans could visit, use, or inhabit regionally during wetter periods. It does not make it a lost naval capital. That is a very different claim, and the evidence does not bridge that gap. What about archaeology, then? This is where the theory usually becomes much less elegant. The published material I found on Risha itself is overwhelmingly geological, which already tells you something about what researchers encounter there. The archaeological work associated with the structure concerns prehistoric stone tool accumulations, especially Preaculan and Aulan material in the depression of the external ring and along nearby wadis. One study summary describes these as lower Paleolithic industry accumulations associated with quaternary sediments and outer ring landscapes. It even suggests there may be buried industry remains in outer alluvial fills. That is interesting. It means people were in the broader landscape in deep prehistory, which should surprise absolutely no one because humans are very good at turning up in places later generations underestimate. But Paleolithic tool scatters are not an urban ruin, and prehistoric presence is not evidence of Atlantis. If anything, the archaeology that is actually discussed around Rasha points toward human use of parts of the landscape over long spans, not toward the remains of a large organized ring city. That may sound deflating, but it really should not. A place can be genuinely ancient, visibly strange, climatically transformed, archaeologically interesting, and still not be Atlantis. In fact, that combination is fairly common in serious ancient world research, which is perhaps why pseudo-history so often takes hold there. Real sites are messy, real timelines are layered, real landscapes preserve multiple ages at once. Risha is geologically ancient, visually dramatic, and archaeologically adjacent to real prehistoric activity. Those are exactly the conditions under which imagination tends to overreach. The mind sees one set of circles, hears one old description, notices one or two broad overlaps, and quietly stops checking the rest. There is another reason the Risha theory feels persuasive to some people, and it has less to do with evidence than with emotional satisfaction. It solves too many things at once. It gives Atlantis a location. It explains the circles. It turns a modern satellite discovery into the key to a classical mystery. It lets the believer feel that establishment scholars missed something obvious because they were too specialized, or too skeptical, or in some tellings too unwilling to admit the truth while standing directly on top of it. That is a very powerful narrative structure. It is the same structure that appears again and again in alternative history. The answer was visible all along, but experts would not see it because they were trapped inside their own assumptions. Occasionally that happens. More often the thing experts are missing is simply not there. Still, it would be unfair to pretend the comparison is stupid from the first glance. The first glance is exactly why the idea survives. Risha is circular enough, large enough, and visually uncanny enough to invite the thought. You can understand how someone gets there. You can even understand how, after reading Plato's description of concentric rings, they might become briefly convinced. The responsible question is not whether the first impression feels strong. The responsible question is what happens when you keep going. And once you do keep going, the geology becomes increasingly decisive. The structure was not formed by human engineering. It was not formed by recent catastrophe. It was not formed at the timescale relevant to Plato's story. It was created by intrusive magmatic processes and prolonged erosion acting on ancient rock. That is not a side note. That is the answer. The old meteor impact idea is a useful example of this. For a while, Risha was thought to be an impact crater. The shape encouraged that conclusion. Later work rejected it. ESA says it was once thought to result from a meteor impact, but is now understood as uplift followed by erosion. IGS says the impact interpretation has been disproved in favor of an intrusion theory. That arc is instructive. First came the dramatic visual explanation, then came the slower, less glamorous geological one. Risha has already taught us once that appearance can mislead when shape is allowed to run ahead of evidence. Atlantis may simply be the second round of the same lesson. There is also the matter of time, which Atlantis theories generally treat with varying levels of optimism and very little discipline. Risha's visible form is the result of geological processes unfolding across immense spans. Mesozoic magmatism, later uplift, then erosion exposing the concentric pattern. The 2024 Lithos paper places major relevant magmatic events around 200 million years ago and roughly 100 million years later. Plato's Atlantis, by contrast, is set in human prehistory. Even if one grants distortion, symbolic dating, or garbled chronology, we are still discussing a human story of civilization and disaster, not a geological structure whose form arises from deep time igneous history. Trying to collapse those two scales into one story requires ignoring the actual origin of the landform. That is not reinterpretation. That is refusal. And yet perhaps the most interesting thing about Risha is not whether it is Atlantis, but why so many people want it to be. Part of the reason is that it speaks to a very modern form of discovery. Earlier generations found ruins in jungles, inscriptions in tells, tombs in valleys. We find things from space. We see patterns the ground traveler could not. We uncover old river systems, buried walls, and landscape geometries with satellites, radar, and multispectral imaging. That technological shift has changed the psychology of mystery. Places like Risha feel as though they belong to a new age of revelation, where the Earth is giving up old shapes all at once under a mechanical gaze. When a place already looks impossible and technology makes it more legible, the temptation to attach it to a famous legend becomes almost irresistible. There is a fairer and more productive way to treat the structure, not as Atlantis itself, but as a reminder of how badly the human eye wants pattern to become story. Risha is a real wonder. It is one of the most distinctive geological forms visible from orbit. It really is about 40 kilometers across. It really is made of concentric ridges. It really did sit within a Sahara that was not always as dry as today. It really does have prehistoric human traces in its broader landscape. None of that is imaginary. The mistake begins only when resemblance is promoted into identification, and uncertainty is replaced by certainty, because certainty is more entertaining. So is the Eye of the Sahara hiding Atlantis in plain sight? The best answer is no. Not on current evidence. What it is hiding in plain sight is something subtler, a demonstration of how a genuine geological marvel can become a vessel for cultural longing. We want Atlantis to survive somewhere. We want it to be large enough to find, strange enough to matter, and visible enough to feel like destiny rather than chance. Risha offers exactly that emotional architecture, which is probably why it keeps reappearing in the conversation. But the geology keeps pulling the dream back to Earth. The circles are natural. The structure is ancient in the wrong sense. The archaeology around it points to prehistoric human presence, not to the remains of Plato's imperial island. The place is real, the fit is not. And once that possibility is set aside, something else opens up that may be more useful. Anyway, if Rashche's not Atlantis, it still belongs to the larger story we have been following. The story of landscapes changing so much that later ages struggle to imagine what they once were. A greener Sahara, prehistoric people using now harsh terrain, ancient geological forms misread as cultural traces. All of that points back to the same unsettling theme. The world has changed more than memory likes to admit. Some places only make sense when seen from above. Some only make sense when seen through climate history. Some only make sense once the sea enters the picture. And that is where the trail leads next. Away from circular stone and desert ridges and toward places where the water really did rise over old human ground and left us with something even more dangerous than a suggestive shape. Actual drowned landscapes. This is where the whole subject stops feeling like a metaphor and starts feeling wet, heavy, and very real. Because once you leave behind the grand theories and the suspiciously confident pointing at satellite images, you run into an awkward fact that no one on either side of the Atlantis debate can really avoid. The sea has taken an enormous amount of human ground, not a little. Not just the odd harbor or a few unfortunate huts built too close to a stormy shore. Vast areas of land that were once dry, habitable, and in many cases attractive to human settlement now lie underwater. Historic England notes that sea level was up to about 130 meters lower than today during parts of the last glacial period. And Noah likewise describes the end of the last ice age as a time when rising seas pushed shorelines inland and submerged huge stretches of former coastal land, along with traces of early human activity. That one fact changes the tone of the Atlantis question immediately. It does not prove a lost super-civilization, but it does make the old line, "We would have found it all by now," sound far less confident than it used to. And the important thing here is not simply that some sites are underwater. Shipwrecks are underwater all the time. And while shipwrecks can be wonderful, tragic, and historically rich, they are not the same thing as drowned landscapes. What matters for this story is that entire former coastlines, river valleys, estuaries, marshes, forests, and settlement corridors now sit below modern seas. Noah's paleo-landscape work of Southern California explicitly treats submerged shelf environments as places where archaeological deposits are likely to survive. Because post-glacial sea level rise drowned regions associated with late Pleistocene and early Holocene occupation. The same logic appears in British research on submerged landscapes, which treats the seabed not as blank space, but as a former human environment still containing paleo-channels, pet outcrops, forest remains, and in some places direct signs of occupation. Once you start seeing the sea floor that way as yesterday's land, rather than today's water, a great deal of the mystery becomes less fantastical and more practical. Of course, things are missing. They're offshore. This is one reason Atlantis has been so difficult to bury completely. The stronger versions of the story may be wrong, but the underlying condition they depend on is absolutely real. human beings have repeatedly lived in coastal zones, and coastal zones have repeatedly moved. Not every change was dramatic in a single afternoon. Much of it happened over generations. But from the perspective of memory, a land that was once there and is now not there amounts to the same kind of wound. Grandparents point seaward and say there used to be ground beyond that line. Fishes bring up worked stone in nets. Peat on tree stumps appear at low tide. Walls turn up where maps say only water should be. Those are not fantasies. Those are the ordinary ways drowned worlds announce themselves. Dogland is probably the clearest large-scale example of this, and also the one most likely to make you pause and reconsider how recently some of these lost worlds still existed. Doggerland was the prehistoric landscape that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, across what is now the North Sea. The University of Bradford, which has been central to recent mapping work, describes it as an Ice Age landmass, later reduced to an archipelago, and then finally inundated. While historic England notes that Britain was only gradually disconnected from continental Europe as sea level rose after around 20,000 years ago, with the Channel and North Sea not reaching their present extent until around 7,000 years ago. This was not a tiny causeway used by the occasional determined pedestrian. It was a substantial landscape with rivers, coasts, wetlands, and places people almost certainly called home, even if we will never know what they called them. For a while, popular imagination loved to treat Dogland as though it had been finished off in one gigantic final act, a single overwhelming disaster that wiped the whole thing away and perhaps inspired every flood story from Yorkshire to somewhere much more dramatic than Yorkshire. But the archaeology and modelling have become more careful than that. The 2020 antiquity study on the Sturga tsunami argues that while the tsunami around 8,150 BP was real and could have been devastating in some areas, the traditional idea of it as the one final catastrophic inundation of Dogland needs rethinking. The authors argue instead for a more nuanced picture in which landscape variation mattered. Some areas were harder hit than others, and the eventual loss of the remaining land was driven by the longer pressure of sea level rise rather than one permanent drowning in a single event. Even so, the emotional outline remains powerful. A once inhabited world gradually shrinks, fragments, and disappears beneath the sea. If later peoples carried stories of lost lowlands and old worlds taken by water, Doggerland shows the basic mechanism is not fantasy. What makes Doggerland especially unsettling is that it is not just inferred in some vague way. It has been mapped, sampled, and modeled using modern marine geophysics and cores. Bradford's recent work describes the landscape as a countryized region that can now be reconstructed from about 20,000 years ago through its reduction into islands and eventual loss beneath the North Sea. Historic England adds that submerged prehistoric landscapes are now studied through marine archaeology, geology, paleo-environmental work and seabed survey, with finds such as hand axes from the North Sea and the Mesolithic site at Bullner Cliff, showing that this drowned world really does preserve traces of human life. So Doggerland matters not because it is Atlantis, but because it proves that an entire named prehistoric landscape can pass from habitable world into underwater research problem. That is a very different way of thinking about the ancient past. Then there is Baldernor Cliff, which is the sort of site that quietly undermines old assumptions without needing any theatrical help. Off the Isle of Wight, under about 11 meters of water, lies what the Maritime Archaeology Trust describes as the only archaeological site in a submerged Mesolithic landscape currently known in the UK. The finds include worked and burnt flints, hearths, wooden structures, worked wood, plant remains, and environmental evidence preserved in waterlogged anaerobic conditions. The site has produced such unusually good preservation that it has transformed understanding of Mesolithic Britain and of what can survive underwater when conditions happen to be kind. It has also shown how fragile that survival is. The same source notes that erosion is actively exposing and damaging the material, meaning archaeologists are often racing not just to discover, but to rescue what the sea has started to give back. That detail matters more than it may first appear. People often imagine underwater archaeology as treasure hunting with better paperwork, but the field has become something much subtler. NOAA explains that maritime archaeologists now prefer to document sites in situ using tools such as side-scan sonar, magnetometers, photogrammetry, and other mapping methods to characterize and interpret places on or under the seabed. This matters for prehistoric sites because the context is everything. A flint tool dredged up by chance is interesting. A flint scatter sitting within a drowned valley edge beside preserved plant remains. Peat deposits and ancient shoreline features is a piece of a world. Once the context is disturbed, much of the meaning goes with it. That is why submerged landscapes are both so exciting and so maddening. They hold enormous potential, but they are difficult to access, expensive to study, and easily damaged by erosion, development, trolling, anchoring, or careless recovery. If Dogland and Baldner Cliff give us drowned landscapes, Pavar Petri gives us something closer to what people usually imagine when they hear the phrase underwater city. Off the southeastern Pelpine in Greece lies a submerged Bronze Age settlement that UNESCO describes as the oldest submerged city in the world. The surviving remains include traces of buildings, courtyards, streets, and burial places. And the site was occupied from the 3rd millennium until about 1100 BCE. This is important because Pavlo Petri is not a speculative shape or a controversial rock formation. It is an actual archaeological site with urban layout visible on the seabed. When people say, "But cities do not just end up underwater," Pavlo Petri's reply is essentially, "Well, one did, and here are the streets." Still, Pavlo Petri also teaches a useful limit. It is a real submerged city, yes, but it is not Atlantis. It is not impossibly old. It is not beyond all known history. It is not evidence of a vanished global civilization. What it proves is something at once more modest and more significant. Coastal urban sites can be drowned, preserved, and studied underwater. A city does not have to vanish into pure legend to be lost below the sea. In some cases, it can remain there partly intact, waiting not for mystics but for marine archaeologists with the patience to map walls 1 meter at a time. That should make us both more cautious and more open-minded. More cautious because genuine underwater sites exist and can be investigated properly, so there is no need to promote every odd shape on the seafloor into a revelation. More open-minded because the existence of sites like Pavlo Petri means the category itself is entirely real. Atlam off the Carmel coast of Israel takes us even deeper into the prehistoric side of the story. The +1 study on nearby Telra and the broader submerged settlement record it summarizes describes Atlitam as the earliest recorded submerged site in that regional sequence. A late pre-pottery Neolithic sea village located 200 to 400 meters offshore at depths of about 8 to 12 meters below present sea level, dated to roughly 9,120 to 8,500 BP. This was not a tiny accidental scatter. It was a permanent village. The same body of research and associated site reports have long shown that Atlat Yam included structures, burials, wells, and signs of mixed subsistence involving farming, herring, and fishing. In other words, by the time the sea finally claimed it, this was already a settled coastal community with a full social life. And near that same coast, the Tail study gives us one of the most moving details in all submerged archaeology, a sea wall. The authors describe a long boulder-built feature at around 3 meters depth on the seaward side of the Neolithic settlement, and interpret it as the earliest known coastal defense of its type. Deliberately built to protect the village from waves and marine erosion following post-glacial sea level rise. It may have worked for a time, they say, but eventually it failed, and the village was abandoned. There is something painfully familiar about that. No mythic empire, no divine punishment, just ordinary human beings realizing the water is becoming a serious problem, gathering stones, building a line against it, and losing in the end. If Atlantis in its deepest emotional form is really about people trying and failing to hold their world against the sea, then a Neolithic seawall in Israel may come closer to the heart of the matter than many grander theories ever do. That is perhaps the biggest shift submerged archaeology is forced on the whole discussion. It has moved us away from asking only whether there was one spectacular lost civilization and toward asking how many ordinary coastal worlds were erased. The more scientists map paleochannels, submerged peat beds, former estuaries, drowned forests and shelved environments, the less plausible it becomes to speak as though the surviving land record captures the full range of early human settlement. N.O.A.'s work in Southern California explicitly frames submerged landscapes as crucial to questions about human migration and habitation, while historic England frames the seabed around Britain as a place where early peoples repeatedly moved, settled and adapted during changing climate and coastlines. This does not tell us that one of those lost worlds was Atlantis. It tells us that the sea has removed a substantial part of the stage on which early human history happened, and because that stage is missing, certain arguments become much less satisfying than they once were. There is no evidence often turns out to mean there is no evidence on land that has been easy to examine under ordinary terrestrial archaeology. But submerged archaeology is not ordinary. It depends on marine surveys, remote sensing, diving, sediment analysis, and often data gathered for entirely different purposes, such as offshore development. It is slower, costlier, and far more selective. NOAA's Maritime Archaeology Overview makes clear that underwater sites require specialized methods just to locate and characterize them. That means absence of evidence in this domain can be less decisive than people sometimes pretend. Especially for very early coastal occupation. One should not abuse that point. It is not permission to fill every gap with fantasy, but it is a real methodological caution and a necessary one. There is also a strange emotional effect that comes from dealing with submerged sites rather than buried inland ones. A buried site feels hidden. A submerged site feels withheld. You know where the sea is. You can stand on the shore and look at it. The lost ground is not somewhere abstract. It is right there, under a surface you can see and not read. That may be one reason why drowned worlds produce such persistent stories. They remain spatially near even when they are practically unreachable. Pavlopetri is offshore. Atlitam is offshore. Dogan lies beneath a busy modern sea crossed by ships, pipelines, cables and trawlers. The lost land is not in another universe. It is under traffic. That nearness is also why so many bad claims flourish in this area. Underwater imagery is deceptive. Erosion can produce regular-looking forms. Sonar can make rough features look architectural. Partial remains can invite massive reconstructions. Some formations are genuinely controversial. Others are plainly natural and only made to seem mysterious by selective framing. The right lesson from submerged archaeology is not that every underwater shape is a city. It is that underwater evidence must be interpreted with even more care than land evidence because visibility is worse. Access is harder and context is easier to distort. Real sites like Pavlopetri and Atal Yamam are therefore extremely important because they show what strong underwater archaeology actually looks like. Plans, dating, structures, material culture, environmental context, repeated survey, and restrained interpretation. Not just. It looks a bit like stairs, therefore civilization. The story becomes even more urgent when you remember that these submerged archives are not safe simply because they are underwater. NOAA warns that underwater cultural heritage is fragile and threatened by stronger weather events, erosion, and sea level change. While UNESCO's interest in places like Pavlopetri reflects the very practical risks from anchoring, pollution, looting, and infrastructure development, Boulder Cliff is actively eroding. Modern seabed development can expose or disturb ancient deposits. In some cases, the same climate-driven coastal instability that once created these drowned landscapes is now threatening what remains of them. So, there is an odd second drowning happening in places like these. First, the sites were lost to the sea. Now, the sea, storms, and human activity are stripping away the conditions that preserved them. Taken together, all of this leaves us in a more complicated, but much more honest position. Atlantis as a single vast capital of concentric rings and imperial power remains unproven. But the broader world that could give rise to Atlantis-like memories is no longer hard to imagine. There were drowned lands, there were submerged villages, there were coastlines that retreated until people abandoned them. There were communities that built against the sea and failed. There were urban places later found under shallow water. There were whole regions like Dogland that passed from inhabited world into seabed. None of that is legend, it is archaeology. And once you accept that, another old category starts to wobble a little. The past is not only buried, sometimes it is flooded, sometimes it is mapped by sonar instead of shovel, sometimes it comes back in fishing nets, in peat samples, in bathymetry, in a line of stones under the water where a village once tried to hold on, and sometimes when people later try to remember what was lost, the memory no longer survives as a site plan or a sea level curve. It survives as a story about an old land taken by water. That still does not get us all the way to Atlantis, but it gets us much closer to understanding why stories like Atlantis never disappear, and why old maps, old coastlines, and old claims about vanished lands keep drawing people back toward the edge of the sea where the missing ground begins. If drowned landscapes give Atlantis its physical plausibility, old maps give it its afterlife. This is where the mystery becomes less about stones and shorelines, and more about the way human beings draw uncertainty. Because once people suspect that something important was lost, they begin looking not only under the sea or under the sand, but in the margins of inherited geography. They start turning pages, studying coastlines, peering at islands that no longer appear on modern charts, and asking whether cartographers close to the old world knew something that later centuries forgot. It is a very understandable impulse. A map feels authoritative even when it is wrong. It has lines, labels, shore shapes, and the sober confidence of something that appears to know where things are. The difficulty is that older maps were rarely just neutral records of measured reality. They were mixtures of observation, inherited texts, rumor, theology, geometry, politics, and hope. If you treat them as photographs, they mislead you almost immediately. If you treat them as evidence of how people imagined and transmitted the unknown, they become much more interesting. The first thing to keep in mind is that not all old maps were trying to do the same job. A medieval mappa mundi was not the same kind of object as a portal and chart. Hereford Cathedral's famous mappa mundi, dated to about 1300, explicitly presents the world in spiritual as well as geographical terms, with the known continents arranged according to a Christian worldview rather than practical navigation. Medieval world maps often oriented east at the top and placed Jerusalem at the center. By contrast, portal charts were working nautical instruments. The Library of Congress explains that portolan charts developed as graphic translations of written sailing directions with coastal place names and compass rose systems designed to help mariners establish direct line courses, especially in the Mediterranean. If one map is meant to describe the moral order of the world, and another is meant to keep a captain from sailing into embarrassment, reading them by the same standard is a mistake from the beginning. That difference matters a great deal for Atlantis, because people who want maps to preserve lost history often slide between kinds of maps without noticing. A symbolic medieval map is treated as though it were a survey. A practical nautical chart is treated as though every unlabeled space on it hides ancient memory. A Renaissance world map is treated as though it could not possibly include speculation, even when speculation is exactly what its maker says or shows. Once that happens, the authority of the map begins doing work the map was never designed to do. It becomes less a historical artifact and more a witness under pressure. The poor thing is expected to confess Atlantis simply because it contains old coastlines and a few suspicious islands. This is where Tommy enters the room, because for many centuries he stood behind European world mapping like a stern schoolmaster, whose lessons were both brilliant and limiting. The Library of Congress notes that the accepted geography of the early 16th century was based on Claudius Ptolemy's Geographia, and that his work remained deeply influential even as Renaissance discoveries began stretching the inherited world beyond what his framework could comfortably hold. The library also notes that Ptolemy miscalculated the size of the Earth, believing it smaller than it really is. That error was not trivial. It affected how distances and unknown spaces were imagined, and it helped create a cacographic culture in which inherited authority and fresh discovery were forced to coexist awkwardly on the same page. When later enthusiasts look at old maps and see continents or islands where none should be, they're often looking at exactly this tension. Observation pressing against old theory. Renaissance cartography is especially dangerous in this regard because it looks so close to modern mapmaking while still carrying a great deal of medieval and classical baggage. Or fine celebrated heart-shaped world map preserved by the Library of Congress in a 1534 edition is a perfect example. The library says Fine's map was inspired by a projection described by Ptolemy and reflected both the geographic knowledge and the hypotheses and uncertainties of its day. It also notes that the map includes a vast terra australis, a hypothetical southern continent posited to balance the northern land masses. That is the key point. Old maps do not only preserve observed places, they also preserve theories about what ought to exist. A continent could appear on a map not because someone had walked it, but because cosmography, symmetry, and inherited reasoning suggested the world would feel more proper if it were there. That should make anyone a little careful before treating a large, beautifully engraved landmass as a hidden memory of something real. The same caution applies perhaps even more strongly to one of the most famous maps ever dragged into alternative history discussions, the Pirates' Map of 1513. UNESCO's Memory of the World description explains that the surviving fragment was discovered in the Topkapi Palace Library in 1929, and that it is a Portoland-style world map created at a time when positioning newly discovered places was extremely difficult. UNESCO also describes it as blending Western and Eastern sources, and notes that it belongs to a transition between Portoland chart practice and more global Mapundi. The nomination form adds that the surviving fragment depicts the Atlantic setting of Europe, Africa, and the eastern shores of the New World, and that the map bears the technical signs of navigational chart making, including compass roses and rhumb lines. That is already more than enough to make it fascinating without forcing Antarctica or Atlantis into the picture. What often happens instead is that the Perry Rice map is treated as a kind of secret archive, a surviving shard of impossible ancient knowledge that somehow captured lands unknown to 16th century sailors. But UNESCO's own documentation points in a different direction. It says the map was compiled from many sources, combines legends with nautical science, and is among the earliest work showing terra auralis. That last detail matters because it places the southern land not in the category of proven hidden continent, but in the much more ordinary early modern habit of drawing a theoretical south. In other words, the map's strangeness is real, but its strangeness belongs to the age of discovery and inherited graphic speculation, not to a suppressed record of an Atlantean world map. The map is precious precisely because it captures that moment where new discoveries, old authorities, legends, and practical navigation were all being stitched together at once. In a way, that makes the Piraeus map more useful to this story, not less. It shows how geographical memory actually behaves when it's under pressure. New coasts are added. Old concepts survive. Mythical creatures remain in the margins. Recently learned information is placed beside inherited assumptions that no longer quite fit. UNESCO even notes that Piraeus' work includes rich illustrations and legendary or semi-mythological elements alongside the latest Atlantic discoveries. That combination is exactly what one should expect from a culture trying to absorb a changing world faster than certainty can keep up. It is not a clean record of hidden antiquity. It is a vivid record of how knowledge, rumor, and imagination share the same sheet of parchment when the world is expanding faster than its explanations. Then there are the Phantom Islands, which may be the most useful corrective of all. They remind us that once something gets onto a map, it can stay there for an absurdly long time, even if it never existed. The Library of Congress has a very good example in Freeland, a phantom island shown on North Atlantic maps during the 16th and 17th centuries. The library explains that Freeland never existed, but graphers believed it was real because of the famous Zeno map published in 1558. Street. Brendan's Island offers an even longer and stranger case. According to the Library of Congress, from the 13th to the 18th century, graphers placed Street, Brendan's Island, on their maps, and expeditions were even launched to find it. High Brazil followed a similar path. The library shows it appearing on maps west of Ireland, then later being labeled Imaginary Isle of O Brazil. Once confidence began to fail, these were not tiny scribal accidents. They were durable cartographic fictions with lives of their own. That should make us much more disciplined when reading vanished lands from old charts. A map can preserve a real place. It can also preserve a reported place, a hoped-for place, a theological place, a literary place, or a mistake that became traditional through repetition. Street. Brendan's Island lasted for centuries because religious legend, maritime rumor, and cartographic inheritance reinforced one another. High Brazil endured because a western island of marvels fit Irish tradition, sailor testimony, and the appetite for Atlantic possibilities. Freeland survived because one influential representation gave later mapmakers something to copy. None of these cases proves that old maps are useless. They prove that maps are social memory, not just measurement. They store what people think might be there, what they want to be there, and what other maps told them had once been there. That last point is especially important for Atlantis because Atlantis itself eventually becomes map-worthy in exactly this way. The Library of Congress holds Athanasius Kircher's 1665 engraving showing insular Atlantis published in Mundus Subterranean. Kircher's map is not evidence that Atlantis had been located. It is evidence that by the 17th century Atlantis had become visually thinkable as a map object. Once Plato's narrative moved through Renaissance and early modern scholarship, it became possible not just to discuss Atlantis, but to place it. That is a different kind of fact. It tells us about the growth of Atlantis as a geographical imagination. The map preserves belief, or at least serious conjecture, not discovery. Yet to later eyes, it can look authoritative simply because it is a map. That is how cartographic afterlives work. A drawn conjecture hardens into apparent witness. The temptation becomes even stronger because maps flatten uncertainty into line. A story says somewhere beyond the Pillars of Heracles. A map says here. A legend says an island once known. A chart gives it coastline proportion and relation to neighboring seas. A hypothetical southern continent becomes a visible landmass. A phantom island gains a recognizable shape. A lost continent acquires borders. The map does not only represent uncertainty, it domesticates it. It makes the unknown look locatable. This is why Atlantis and maps are such an enduring combination. The map offers relief from ambiguity, even when that relief is counterfeit.
It lets the mind stop wandering and start pointing. There is another subtle problem here, and it may be the most misleading of all. Ancient and early modern maps often preserve older coastlines in an intellectual sense without preserving them in a literal one. By that I mean a coastline might be drawn from an inherited source long after the underlying geographical theory has changed. A place name may persist after the place has become doubtful. A continental form may survive because it belongs to an accepted cosmographic scheme, not because anyone has seen it recently. The Library of Congress description of Fiennes's map explicitly says it reflects the hypotheses and uncertainties of its day, while the library's Tomic material emphasizes how deeply 16th century geography still depended on toy. So when enthusiasts say a map proves someone remembered a vanished land, the safer answer is often that the map proves someone inherited a cartographic tradition. Memory, yes, but not necessarily memory of observation. Often it is memory of authority. This is why the edge of memory in old maps is so compelling. It is not simply the edge of the known world. It is the edge where texts, voyages, and inherited beliefs overlap without agreeing fully. Medieval mapmakers placed Jerusalem at the center because the world was understood through sacred history. Portolan makers filled coastlines with practical names because ships required usable bearings. Renaissance world maps stretched and bent to absorb the new world while still carrying old theories like terra australis. Ottoman cartographers like Peri Reis blended nautical intelligence, legends, and multilingual sources. By the time Atlantis enters this environment as a place that might be mapped, it is joining a world where maps are already repositories of mixed memory. Some of what they show is exact, some is inherited, some is speculative, some is simply wishful geography in a handsome frame. And yet one should not swing too far the other way and say, old maps tell us nothing useful. They do tell us something, just not always what enthusiasts first want. They tell us how unknown space was imagined in successive periods. They tell us which rumors became stable enough to draw. They tell us where mariners expected islands, where scholars expected balancing continents, where sacred history outranked physical measurement, and where practical coast knowledge was strongest. They also tell us something about disappearance. The very existence of persistent phantom islands shows how difficult it is to remove a land once tradition has admitted it. That is oddly relevant to Atlantis. If a drowned land or old island tradition really did survive into later storytelling, one possible afterlife for it would not be a perfect survey, but a lingering catastrophic ghost. A place copied, shifted, renamed, doubted, and redrawn long after its original meaning was gone. This is also where many modern Atlantis claims make their decisive mistake. They see an old map and assume that age itself equals authority. But old maps are often authoritative only within their own logic. A Hereford-style world map is authoritative about 13th century Christian world order, not about Atlantic pymemetry. A Portolan chart is authoritative about practiced coastal navigation, not necessarily about inland cosmology. A Renaissance world map may be authoritative about the state of speculation in 1534, not about hidden prehistoric continents. The problem is not that older people were foolish. The problem is that we misread what kind of truth their maps were designed to carry. If there is one map tradition that comes closest to the emotional logic of Atlantis, it is probably not the grand world map at all, but the repeated Atlantic habit of drawing islands just beyond reliable knowledge. St. Brendan, High Brazil, Freeland. These were lands at the edge of approach, never wholly absurd, never wholly confirmed, drifting in and out of confidence as testimony, copying, and desire reshaped them. That pattern should sound familiar by now. Atlantis functions much the same way in the Western imagination. It remains just beyond certainty, always plausible enough to redraw, never stable enough to settle. Kirch's Atlantis map in 1665 is not the beginning of that process, but a vivid symptom of it. By then, the legend had crossed fully into cartographic imagination. It could now be placed on paper with apparent confidence, which is often the most dangerous stage of any mystery. So, what do maps from the edge of memory really give us? Not coordinates for Atlantis. Certainly not in any simple sense. What they give us is a record of how human cultures negotiate the unknown. They show us that geography is never only a matter of land and sea. It is also inheritance, prestige, doctrine, rumor, and longing. They show us that missing places can persist for centuries when copied by trusted hands. They show us that theoretical lands can look as solid as observed ones. They show us that once a place enters imagination strongly enough, it can survive on parchment long after direct experience has failed to confirm it. In that respect, old maps may not preserve Atlantis itself, but they do preserve the exact mental world in which Atlantis could continue to live. And perhaps that is why this part of the trail is so hard to leave. A map is supposed to clarify. Yet the older the map becomes, the more clearly it reveals the fog in which it was made. Coastlines sharpen and blur. Islands appear and vanish. Sacred centers hold steady while oceans expand. The world is drawn, then redrawn, then doubted, then inherited again. Somewhere in that process lies the real connection between maps and lost civilizations. Not that the map secretly kept a perfect memory, but that it preserved the struggle not to forget entirely. That struggle continues when we turn from charts to stone again, because once the maps have shown us how uncertain memory can be, The next question is no longer just where Atlantis was supposed to be drawn. It is who in the real ancient world was capable of building places grand enough, durable enough, and strange enough to survive in memory long after their meaning had begun to slip. There is a certain look people get when they stand in front of very old stone. It is not quite fear, not quite reverence, not quite confusion, though it contains a little of all three. The look says more or less somebody made this, and I do not feel entirely comfortable with what that implies. A worked flint or a petard rarely produces that reaction. Useful objects are easy for the modern mind to place, but a gigantic tomb chamber, a ring of uprights, a corridor aligned to sunrise, an avenue of standing stones disappearing into the landscape, those things create trouble. They're too large to feel accidental, too old to feel familiar, and too silent to explain themselves. This is where the idea of forgotten builders begins, not because the builders are literally unknown in every case, but because the monuments are still standing long after the names, languages, and ordinary details of the people who raised them have gone missing. Stonehenge and Avery are among the most famous megalithic complexes in the world. While Brunner preserves Europe's largest and most important concentration of prehistoric megalithic art, and the temples of Malta remain architectural masterpieces, despite the limited resources available to their builders. Those are not fantasies. They are the official descriptions of real places that still make modern people uneasy in exactly the same old way. That unease is one of the great engines of Atlantis thinking, because once people become uncomfortable with the scale or sophistication of prehistoric monument building, they begin looking for a builder grand enough to match the feeling. Sometimes that builder becomes Atlantan. Sometimes it becomes a vanished priesthood, a mysterious maritime elite, a master culture that moved around teaching everyone else how to stack stones and think cosmic thoughts. It is a very old habit. If a monument feels too impressive for the people we imagine should have existed at that date, we quietly replace those people with some other people we find easier to mythologize. The trouble is that archaeology, in its patient and deeply unromantic way, keeps taking that move apart. The stones are mysterious. Yes, the builders were real human communities also. Yes, the names are gone, but the societies were not imaginary. What is missing is often not the builders themselves, but our willingness to give prehistoric people the full weight of their own achievements. Take Stonehenge, the one everyone knows and almost nobody can resist narrating with a slightly lowered voice. English Heritage describes it as the world's best-known ancient stone circle, built around 4,500 years ago within one of Europe's richest archaeological landscapes. UNESCO goes further and calls it the most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric stone circle in the world, noting not just the size of its stones, but the precision of its concentric plan, the dressing of the stones, and the uniquely careful joints that lock lintels and uprights together. This is not a rough arrangement of boulders dropped in a field and later upgraded by imagination. It is designed architecture. It belongs to a ceremonial Andorrary landscape that developed over around 2,000 years from about 3,700 BC into the Bronze Age. In other words, Stonehenge was not a lone flash of genius. It was part of a long tradition of monumental landscape making by Neolithic and Bronze Age communities in Britain. And what makes Stonehenge more interesting, not less, is that the mystery has not evaporated, even as the builders have become more understandable. English Heritage says the general interpretation most accepted today is that Stonehenge was a prehistoric temple aligned with the movements of the sun, a place tied to ancestors, ceremonies, and important points in the calendar, while still acknowledging that the monument's exact ceremonial use remains unknown. So the modern picture is not "we solved Stonehenge, and now it is boring." It is we know enough to place it in the real social and ritual world of prehistoric Britain, and enough remains uncertain to preserve its power. That is a much healthier form of mystery than blaming everything on a conveniently absent civilization. It also means the real achievement belongs where it should belong, to Neolithic people with technical skill, symbolic systems, labor organization, and the patience to shape a landscape across generations. The same pattern appears when you look at where Stonehenge's stones actually came from. Most of the blue stones are associated with West Wales, and English Heritage notes that the stones were brought from long distances, with the blue stones coming from the Preseli Hills over 150 miles away. More recently, new research reported by UCL and published in Nature found that the central altar stone likely came not from Wales at all, but from northeast Scotland, implying a journey of at least 700 kilometers. UCL's summary says this distance is astonishing for the period and raises serious questions about connectivity and transport in Neolithic Britain. Notice what has happened there. A discovery that sounds at first like good material for pseudo-history actually points in the opposite direction. The farther the stone traveled, the less we need imaginary builders and the more we need to take prehistoric human organization seriously. The real lesson is not that Stonehenge is impossible. The real lesson is that the people who built it were connected, capable, and operating across larger networks than older assumptions once allowed. Move across the Irish Sea and the same old problem returns in a different form. Brunabur, with New Grangenth and Douth at its heart, is described by UNESCO as airy landscape of great ritual significance and as Europe's largest and most important concentration of prehistoric megalithic art. These monuments had social, economic, religious, and literary functions, and the larger landscape contains many more satellite passage graves and associated sites. The Irish state's own heritage material dates the main passage tombs to about 5,000 years ago. New Grange remains especially famous because at winter solstice sunrise for about 17 minutes, sunlight enters through the roof box above the entrance and reaches into the chamber. That alignment is not folklore. It is an observed architectural fact still marked publicly in Ireland today. Once again, the monument is old enough to feel mythic and precise enough to remind us that myths are not required to explain competence. What is so unsettling about places like New Grange is that they make prehistoric intention feel uncomfortably close. A burial mound is one thing. A burial mound built at a scale that dominates the landscape is another. A burial mound engineered so that winter solstice light enters through a specially contrived opening and reaches the chamber is something else. Again, it tells you immediately that the builders were not merely piling stone out of practical necessity. They were organizing space, death, time, and the sky into one coherent structure. They were building memory into architecture, and that may be the deepest reason megalithic sites generate so much wild speculation. Their symbolism feels too integrated to modern eyes. They look as though somebody had a full system. The mainstream answer is that they did. The somebody was not Atlantis, but Neolithic communities whose cosmology, social life, and ritual practices were sophisticated enough to produce monuments that still command attention 5 millennia later. Malta makes the same point in a harsher, more compact way. UNESCO's description of the megalithic temples of Malta notes 7 temple sites across Malta and Gu, each representing an individual development with Hagar Kim. Antarxian described as unique architectural masterpieces given the limited resources available to their builders. That phrase is very useful. Limited resources does not mean limited imagination, and it certainly does not mean limited technical skill. If anything, the Maltese sites sharpen the question of what small island communities can do when they organize labor, ritual, and stone with great seriousness. These temples are among the oldest monumental stone constructions in the world. Older than many monuments, people more readily grant cultural prestige. Yet because they belong to prehistory, they are still repeatedly pulled into the orbit of speculation. Once again, the temptation is to go looking for some teacher civilization grander than the local one. Once again, the local one turns out to be sufficient if only we stop insulting it. Then there is Brittany, where the sheer number of megaliths begins to wear down resistance by volume alone. The French Ministry of Culture describes the megaliths of Morbihan as the world's first large-scale stone architecture, emphasizing places like Carrack and Lochmaraka, and dating the phenomenon in the region to roughly 6,000 years ago in the Neolithic. Carrack standing stones are often treated in popular culture as though they were an isolated absurdity, but they are better understood as part of a larger megalithic landscape along the Atlantic facade. Here the problem changes slightly. Instead of one famous site demanding a special explanation, we have a whole pattern of monument buildings spread across coasts and regions. At that scale, the forgotten builder idea becomes both more seductive and less necessary. More seductive because the recurrence invites thoughts of some connected ancient system. Less necessary because archaeology increasingly sees exactly that connection, mobility and transmission, but among real Neolithic societies rather than a vanished master race with better public relations. In fact, one of the most important developments in megalithic research over the last decade has been a renewed willingness to take maritime connections seriously. A 2019 study summarized by the University of Gothenburg and published in PNAS analyzed more than 2,400 radiocarbon dates and argued that the earliest megalith graves arose in northwest France and that the megalith tradition then diffused in largely three phases, strongly suggesting mobility by sea routes. The same summary notes that there are approximately 35,000 megaliths across Europe, mostly concentrated in coastal areas. That is a remarkable picture. It does not describe one lost civilization planting monuments everywhere. It describes a long-lived monumental tradition spreading through connected societies that were far more mobile and seafaring than older stereotypes once allowed. For Atlantis-style thinking, this is both an invitation and a restraint. The invitation is obvious. There really were maritime networks in deep prehistory. The restraint is even more important. We do not need Atlantis to explain them. Ancient DNA has pushed the argument further in a way that matters enormously for the forgotten builder question. A 2019 PNAS study on individuals buried in megalithic tombs across northwestern Europe found that the people interred there showed genetic affinities with local farming groups in their different regions and periods, while also displaying a mixture with local hunter-gatherers. The study also found kin relationships within the tomb populations and evidence suggesting that at least some monuments were associated with patrinal kindred groups. This is one of those quiet but decisive findings. It means that in at least a number of cases, the people using these megalithic monuments were not mysterious outsiders of unknown biological origin swooping in from a vanished homeland. They were connected to the local Neolithic farming populations of the regions where the monuments stand. The builders may be forgotten in name, but they are not ghosts. They are traceable human communities with family structures, burial practices, and demographic histories. That does not make the monuments less strange. It makes them more human. Laughter, and perhaps that is part of why so many people resist it. A truly anonymous builder is easier to romanticize than a real farming community with obligations, kinship patterns, burial customs, and perhaps a rather ordinary number of interpersonal disagreements. We like our mysteries big and clean. The truth is often social. Megaliths look eternal, but they were built by people whose lives were not. They required food, labor, planning, agreement, probably coercion now and then, and a strong reason to keep going when the novelty of moving another great stone had almost certainly worn off. A line of standing stones in Brittany or a passage tomb in Ireland does not simply announce engineering. It announces social order, or at least social enough order to persuade bodies to work in the same direction for something that outlived them. That may be the most impressive part of all. This is also where the mainstream view becomes both more modest and more powerful than the Atlantis alternative. Mainstream archaeology does not say every megalithic site belongs to one single culture or was built for one single purpose, quite the opposite. The monuments vary greatly in form, function, chronology, and local meaning. Some are passage graves, some are dolmens, some are long barrows, some are stone circles, some are temple complexes, some align clearly with celestial events. Others seem more concerned with burial, territory, procession, ancestry, or landscape framing. UNESCO's descriptions of Stonehenge, Brunabwen, and Malta all emphasize different combinations of ceremonial, airy, religious, social, and architectural significance. The unity lies not in one lost empire, but in a wider prehistoric willingness to monumentalize stone and landscape. It is a family resemblance, not a centralized bureaucracy. And yet the emotional pull of a single explanation remains very strong. One reason is that megaliths are so good at surviving while everything around them changes. Wooden houses rot, boundaries shift, languages vanish, fields are replouded, rivers alter course, religions replace one another. The stones remain. Over time, that can create a very misleading impression. It makes the monuments seem older in a civilizational sense than the ordinary world around them, as though they belong to someone not quite like the later people living nearby. In reality, many megalithic sites were remembered, reused, reinterpreted, and folded into later traditions precisely because they remained visible. They became anchors in local memory. Later peoples did not always know who built them, but they did not ignore them either. That is another route by which forgotten builders becomes exaggerated. The builders are forgotten in detail, but the monuments were often never forgotten at all. This is where Atlantis usually tries to slip back in. If there were maritime links, if there were major stone monuments, If there were societies capable of moving stones over long distances and encoding ritual in architecture, then perhaps people say these are remnants of something larger, something older, something now lost. The fair answer is that the first half of that sentence is exactly what archaeology already accepts, and the second half is where evidence begins to thin. Yes, there were connected prehistoric societies. Yes, they built in stone on astonishing scales. Yes, some traditions spread across coasts and may have depended heavily on seafaring. Yes, some landscapes and sites are now lost or transformed. But the available evidence still points toward multiple regional Neolithic and Bronze Age traditions, not toward a single vanished Atlantean civilization serving as universal source. The mystery, in other words, is real. The shortcut explanation is not, and perhaps that leaves us with a better understanding of what forgotten builders should mean. It should not mean that we invent a grander people whenever prehistoric achievements make us uncomfortable. It should mean that the actual builders have become difficult to recover in the intimate sense. We no longer know their songs, jokes, rivalries, or proper names. We do not know who proposed the plan for New Grange, who argued over the line of a stone avenue, who first decided the solstice mattered enough to build around, who supervised the dragging of a lintel, or who stood back at dusk and thought, perhaps with satisfaction, or perhaps with exhaustion. Yes, that will do. Those are the builders we have forgotten, not because they were magical, but because they were human and far away. Their monuments remain because stone remembers structure longer than culture remembers biography. So the stone giants do not really force us toward Atlantis. They force us toward a more difficult kind of respect. They ask us to accept that very old societies could be organized, symbolic, mobile, and technically ambitious without needing to be rescued by fantasy. They also remind us that some forms of greatness become easier to deny once writing is absent. A literate empire leaves names. A megalithic landscape leaves stone. We tend to trust the names more even when the stones are still standing in front of us. And once you let that settle for a moment, the final question begins to feel less like a challenge and more like an obligation. If Plato's Atlantis may be literary, if flood memory may preserve real loss, if drowned coasts are real, if prehistoric monument builders were more capable and better connected than older models allowed, then what exactly will mainstream science permit us to say? And where does it still draw the line with good reason? That boundary between healthy revision and wishful overreach is where the whole story has been quietly heading all along. By the time you reach the end of this trail, the most honest question is no longer, was Atlantis real, asked in the simple yes or no way people prefer when they are tired. The better question is what exactly science is willing to accept once all the noise has been cleared away. And the answer is more interesting than either total belief or total dismissal. Science is perfectly willing to accept that Plato's story became attached to real human anxieties about catastrophe, drowned coasts, and forgotten history. It is willing to accept that the late Ice Age and early Holocene were times of major environmental instability. It is willing to accept that prehistoric societies were more capable, more mobile, and more socially complex than older textbook versions allowed. What it is not willing to accept, at least not yet, is that all of this adds up to a single lost global civilization matching Plato's Atlantis in any direct historical sense. That distinction is the whole subject in miniature. And once you see it clearly, Atlantis stops being a childish mystery and becomes a serious lesson in how evidence, memory, and desire keep colliding. The first firm boundary science draws is around the text itself. Atlantis enters the ancient record through Plato's Tous and Cytus, and those dialogues remain the principal source for the story. Modern scholarship has long treated the Atlantis narrative primarily as a philosophical and ideological construction, not as ordinary historiography. A Cambridge analysis of Plato's Atlantis story describes it as a myth shaped by 4th century political concerns and by Plato's idealized image of Athens. While Britannica notes that the principal sources of Plato's dialogues, and that the legend may reflect historical material only in a very indirect way, if at all that does not make the story worthless, it makes it dangerous in a very specific way. Plato is detailed enough to tempt literal readers and literary enough to satisfy symbolic ones. Because of that, the mainstream position is not that Atlantis is proven false in every conceivable underlying sense. It is that Plato's Atlantis, as Plato gives it to us, is not reliable evidence for a literal, fully formed historical empire waiting to be identified on a map. Even so, science does not require that Plato invented every element from nothing. That is another place where people often become too rigid. Britannica's summary notes the long-running possibility that the tale may have been influenced by memories of the Thera eruption and the damage done to Mino, that identification is not a clean fit for Plato's geography or chronology. The important thing here is not whether the solves Atlantis. It does not. The important thing is that mainstream scholarship leaves room for composite origins. A literary story can absorb older motifs, remembered disasters, foreign traditions, and moral themes all at once. In other words, the choices are not limited to perfect historical report or pure invention with no roots in anything. Science is usually comfortable with messy middle positions when the evidence points that way, and Atlantis is almost certainly a middle position subject, if it is anything at all. Where the scientific case becomes much stronger is not in Plato, but in the planet. The Younger Dryas was a real abrupt climate event, and No describes it as a roughly 1,200 to 1,300 year reversal in warming near the end of the last ice age, with especially sharp changes in the North Atlantic world. NAI also notes that the end of the event was particularly abrupt, and PNAS describes the Younger Dryas as an extreme climatic reversal during the transition into the present warm period. This does not prove Atlantis, but it destroys one of the old lazy objections to Atlantis-like memory, which was that the late prehistoric world was too stable or too simple to generate deep cultural memories of upheaval. It was not. The Earth changed hard enough and in some places fast enough to leave long scars in human communities. If later societies remembered an earlier world broken by water, cold, migration, and loss, science has no trouble accepting that such memories could have real environmental roots. Sea level is where this becomes even more concrete. Historic England says sea level was up to about 130 meters lower during parts of the last glacial period, and NOAA's underwater archaeology material explains that as the Ice Age ended, rising seas submerged large coastal areas that had once been habitable land. A major archaeological review in World Archaeology says that before modern sea level stabilized, large areas of paleo shoreline and coastal hinterland were exposed and then drowned again, meaning that important parts of late Pleistocene and early Holocene human history now lie underwater. That is not fringe speculation. It is one of the basic conditions of coastal archaeology. So when science is asked whether lost shores could have existed, the answer is immediate. Yes, of course they did. What science refuses to do is treat every lost shore as evidence for one singular legendary civilization. Lost coastlines are normal. Atlantis is a much stronger claim. Science is also more open than many people realize to the possibility that oral tradition can preserve ancient environmental memory. A 2022 geoarchaeology study argues that several Northwest European submergent stories plausibly preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise, in some cases enduring for thousands of years. A 2023 Journal of Archaeological Science study on Tasmanian Aboriginal traditions argues that oral narratives about the flooding of the Bassian land bridge may preserve memory reaching back to around 12,000 years ago. Those studies do not prove that every flood myth is a literal eyewitness record, and they certainly do not prove Atlantis, but they do matter because they establish something mainstream science once treated much more skeptically. Under the right cultural conditions, stories can preserve real information about ancient land loss and environmental change across astonishing spans of time. Once that is accepted, the old smug line that myths are useless because people could never remember that far back becomes much harder to defend. At the same time, science still insists on limits, and those limits are reasonable. A tradition may preserve a memory of submergence without preserving exact chronology, precise geography, or reliable causal explanation. Flood stories can encode real loss while still exaggerating scale, moralizing events, or merging multiple episodes into one narrative. That is why mainstream researchers who take oral traditions seriously do not usually say the story is true exactly as told. They say something more careful, that a story may contain durable cultural memory linked to real landscape change. This is a crucial distinction for Atlantis. Science will accept the possibility that some part of the Atlantis story resonates with ancient memories of disaster or lost coasts. It will not accept the claim that Plato's entire account should therefore be read as straightforward historical reporting. Those are not the same thing, and collapsing them is where bad history usually begins. Archaeology has also changed the conversation by making the prehistoric world itself less primitive than older models allowed. UNESCO describes Göbekli as monumental architecture built by communities living during the transition from hunter-gathering to the first farming societies, and the German Archaeological Institute now treats the site not as a purely ritual mountain shrine, but as a settlement with a strong ritual component and evidence of domestic activity. The problem this creates is not that civilization appeared fully formed much too early. It is that our old categories were clumsy. Monumentality, social coordination, symbolic complexity, and specialized labor clearly existed earlier than many earlier narratives expected. That does not give us Atlantis. It does remove the bad assumption that nothing socially impressive could have existed in deep prehistory. Science has already revised itself on that point. The same goes for the great megalithic landscapes of Europe. PNAS work on radiocarbon dating supports a maritime diffusion model for megalith spreading in phases along sea routes. And a separate 2019 PNA's ancient DNA study found that people buried in northwestern European megalithic tombs were genetically connected to regional Neolithic farming populations, with evidence in at least some cases for kin-based patrilineal social structures. That combination is extremely important. It means science accepts that prehistoric societies were seafaring, connected, and monumentally ambitious across wide coastal zones. But it also means the builders were not mysterious outsiders of unknown origin. The monuments belong to real prehistoric populations in those regions, not to a hidden Atlantean master culture teaching everyone how to move stone. The evidence points toward local societies with broad exchange and maritime links, not toward a vanished source civilization standing behind all of them. Submerged archaeology reinforces exactly the same lesson. Dogland, the lost North Sea landscape between Britain and mainland Europe, is treated by Historic England and the University of Bradford as a real former landmass later reduced and submerged by post-glacial sea level rise. Baldner Cliff, described by the Maritime Archaeology Trust and the University of York, has produced clear Mesolithic materials in a drowned landscape off the Isle of Wight. Pavel Petri, recognized by UNESCO, is a real submerged Bronze Age settlement with streets and buildings. These examples matter because they show that drowned human landscapes and underwater settlements are not hypothetical categories. They are established archaeological realities. Science therefore accepts that many coastal worlds were lost and that some are still being found. But again, the evidence supports many local or regional losses, not one global lost empire. The sea took plenty of human ground without requiring Atlantis to explain every one of those losses. Then there are the places science is much less flexible because the evidence there is strong in the opposite direction. The Richer structure is the clearest example. The International Union of Geological Sciences describes it as a geological dome, and complex alkaline intrusion with concentric ridges produced by deep-time geological processes. And a 2024 Lithos paper says it is now consensually recognized as a complex igneous intrusion rather than a human-made feature. In plain terms, Richet is extraordinary, but it is extraordinary geology. Science is not going to treat a natural 40-kilometer structure formed through ancient magmatic processes and erosion as Atlantis simply because it happens to look circular from space. This is one of the places where mainstream rejection is not narrow-mindedness. It is just geology doing its job. This brings us to the point where science draws its hardest line. There is still no credible archaeological evidence for a global advanced lost civilization of the type often imagined in popular Atlantis literature. There is no securely identified Atlantean material culture. No inscriptions, no accepted urban site matching Plato's description, no network of monuments demonstrably built by one vanished maritime superstate, and no accepted dataset showing that megaliths Gowep, submerged villages, and classical legend all reduced to one source. On the contrary, the strongest evidence we do have tends to localize and diversify the picture. Megaliths arise in specific Neolithic traditions. GBC belongs to early Holocene Upper Mesopotamia. Dogland belongs to North Sea prehistory. Pavlo Petri belongs to the Bronze Age Ayan. Rish belongs to geology. Plato belongs to classical philosophy. Science can connect these as parts of a larger discussion about memory catastrophe and the incompleteness of the record. What it cannot do is fuse them into one civilization without evidence that actually forces that conclusion. That phrase, without evidence that forces the conclusion, is worth dwelling on because it says something important about how science really works. Science does not reject lost civilizations because the idea is too exciting. Science rejects weak versions of the idea because they are weak. If tomorrow a submerged site were found with unambiguous architecture, datable material, regional connections, inscriptions, and repeatable evidence linking it to a previously unknown complex society, mainstream archaeology would not refuse to look. It would become obsessed with it. Science is conservative about claims, but not about evidence. The problem for Atlantis has never been that researchers hate wonder. The problem is that the strong claims keep outrunning the strong data. Where the evidence is good, as at GBCE or Pavlo Petri, archaeology has already revised its models. Where the evidence is poor, as in many Atlantis identifications, archaeology remains unconvinced for the simple reason that it should. So what remains after the digging, the mapping, the climate cores, the genetics, the biomimicry, and the endless argument? Something rather important, actually. Atlantis survives best not as a place science has verified, but as a compressed cultural object carrying several truths at once. It carries the truth that civilizations can forget more than they realize. It carries the truth that coastlines move and human worlds can drown. It carries the truth that prehistory was more complex than older generations allowed. It carries the truth that oral tradition may preserve surprising amounts of environmental memory. And it carries one uncomfortable warning about interpretation. When evidence is fragmentary, people tend to fill the gaps with stories that reflect what they want history to have been. Sometimes that creates useful hypotheses. Sometimes it creates nonsense with excellent cover art. Science's job is to separate those two without losing the deeper lesson that made the story compelling in the first place. That, I think, is why the deeper we dig into Atlantis, the stranger it gets. Not because the final answer turns out to be a lost empire with neat rings and dramatic lighting, but because the real past is already strange enough. The climate did lurch, the sea did rise, landscapes did vanish, oral memories may have lasted far longer than once assumed. Monument builders did appear earlier, and with greater sophistication than older models expected. Underwater archaeology really is recovering pieces of drowned human worlds. Plato really did shape a story powerful enough to absorb all of those anxieties into one unforgettable image. Science at its best is willing to hold all of that complexity at once. It will not give us Atlantis as certainty, but it will tell us something both humbler and more unsettling. The legend endures because the world that could produce such a legend was real, fractured, and only partly remembered.